Hey guys, tonight we're going to peel back the shimmering, sun-drenched layers of ancient Egypt, that land of golden pharaohs, colossal pyramids, and inscrutable gods. You picture yourself wandering through the Valley of the Kings, the air, thick with the scent of ancient dust and untold stories, perhaps imagining the cool, clean stone of a newly carved tomb. But trust me, you probably won't survive a day in the actual, unglamorous reality of their world without a serious case of, well, let's just say, you'd be reaching for the hand sanitizer a lot. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. From the moment you conjure an image of ancient Egypt, your mind likely fills with grandeur. The majestic, unyielding silhouette of the Great Pyramid piercing the cerulean sky, the Sphinx gazing stoically across the sands, the glittering gold of Tutankhamun's burial mask, and the serene, timeless faces of gods and goddesses adorning temple walls. This is the Egypt of our dreams, a civilization built on an almost incomprehensible scale, seemingly touched by divine order, where every aspect of life, from the lowliest peasant to the mightiest pharaoh, appeared meticulously crafted for eternity. It's the Egypt we see in documentaries, in museums, on the pages of history books, a place of unparalleled artistic achievement, profound spiritual belief, and an enduring mystery that has captivated humanity for millennia. You imagine the scent of lotus blossoms, the gentle lapping of the Nile, the whisper of papyrus in the breeze. It's all very cinematic, isn't it? Very clean, very polished. But what if I told you that this glittering facade, this meticulously curated image of perfection and divine splendor, was merely a veil? A beautiful, shimmering curtain drawn across a much grittier, messier, and often downright filthy reality? Tonight, we're going to gently, almost imperceptibly, pull back that curtain. We're going to peer behind the polished gold and the hieroglyphic pronouncements to uncover the surprising, sometimes shocking, and frequently uncomfortable truths that lay beneath the surface of this iconic civilization. Forget the serene pharaohs for a moment. Let's talk about the daily grind, the smells, the struggles, and the very human imperfections that truly defined life along the Nile. You see, while the pharaohs were busy commissioning monumental temples and preparing their elaborate tombs for a perfect afterlife, the vast majority of Egyptians were living lives that bore little resemblance to the pristine imagery left behind. Imagine, if you will, the relentless heat of the Egyptian sun, not just as a backdrop, but as an oppressive, ever-present force. You're not in an air-conditioned museum. You're living in a mud brick house, often shared with extended family. Perhaps even some livestock, where the only respite comes from the occasional breeze off the river, which might also bring with it the distinct aroma of, well, everything. The ancient Egyptians were masters of PR even before the term existed. Their monuments, their art, their very way of life were designed to convey an image of stability, prosperity, and divine favor. Every inscription, every statue, every carefully preserved mummy was a testament to their belief in order, in Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth, justice, and balance. They wanted to project an image of a society where everything was in its right place, from the celestial movements to the social hierarchy. And for the most part, they succeeded, at least in terms of what has survived to shape our modern perception. We look at the perfectly preserved artifacts, the vibrant tomb paintings, and we infer a life of elegance and grace. But the truth, as it often is, was far more complex and considerably less fragrant. Consider the daily grind for the common Egyptian. Your life revolved around the Nile, the annual inundation bringing fertile silt, but also, inevitably, disease-carrying mosquitoes and parasites. You'd be covered in dust, sweat, and the byproducts of a life lived outdoors, without the luxury of modern sanitation. Forget your morning shower. A dip in the Nile might be your best bet, alongside everyone else. And their laundry and their livestock. It's a bit like a perpetual camping trip, only you're not there for leisure, and the plumbing system hasn't been invented yet. You'd be surprised how quickly the romantic notion of living in ancient times evaporates when you consider the pervasive presence of flies, the lack of proper waste disposal, and the constant battle against the elements. Point one mainstream historical fact that often gets overlooked in the grand narrative is the sheer, backbreaking physical labor that underpinned everything. Those magnificent pyramids, they weren't built by alien technology or magic, but by hundreds of thousands of human hands, toiling under the scorching sun, day after day, for decades. We're talking about moving millions of tons of stone without the benefit of wheels, cranes, or even iron tools for much of their history. Imagine the calloused hands, the aching backs, the sunburnt skin, and the constant threat of injury or exhaustion. It wasn't just the pyramids. It was the temples, the canals, the quarries, the agricultural fields, all demanded an immense, continuous output of human energy. It's the kind of work that makes your modern desk job feel like a spa day, doesn't it? And speaking of daily life, here's a quirky tidbit. While we often associate ancient Egyptian makeup, particularly kohl, with beauty and status, its primary function was actually quite practical. You see, the harsh desert sun was incredibly bright, and the fine, dark powder used as kohl around the eyes wasn't just for dramatic effect. It actually helped reduce the sun's glare, acting as a natural form of sunglasses. Moreover, some ancient recipes for kohl contained lead salts, which, while toxic in large doses, were believed to have mild antiseptic properties, potentially protecting the eyes from infections caused by the omnipresent flies. So, your glamorous eye makeup was also your ancient SPF and fly repellent. Talk about multitasking. The popular image of ancient Egypt often portrays a society of meticulous order and unwavering religious devotion, where every aspect of life was carefully regulated. And indeed, to a large extent, it was. But beneath that veneer of perfect societal structure and divine rule, there were profound human struggles. Historians still argue whether the common people truly felt the benefit of the pharaoh's divine rule in their daily lives. Beyond the basic provision of food and safety, was it a benevolent dictatorship, or was the grand vision of the pharaohs simply too far removed from the dirt and toil of the average villager? You look at a pharaoh's opulent tomb, filled with treasures meant to accompany them into the afterlife, and then you consider the small, simple graves of the vast majority of the population, often just a shallow pit in the sand. The contrast is stark, a testament to the immense disparity between the rulers and the ruled. This glittering facade was a powerful tool, both for internal control and external projection. It was a way to maintain social cohesion, to inspire awe, and to reinforce the idea that the pharaoh was indeed a god on earth, indispensable for the continued prosperity of the two lands. But the reality was that even divine rulers had their feet, and often their courts, mired in the same human frailties, the same biological necessities, and the same environmental challenges as everyone else. They just had significantly more people to clean up after them. So, as we embark on this journey, remember that the filthy secrets aren't just about sensationalism. They are about understanding the full, complex tapestry of a civilization that was, at once, incredibly advanced and profoundly primitive by our modern standards. It's about appreciating the ingenuity and resilience of a people who achieved so much, not in spite of their challenges, but often because of them. The grandeur of Egypt is undeniable, but it is made all the more compelling when you understand the gritty, very human struggle that powered it. We're not here to diminish their achievements, but to deepen our appreciation by seeing the full picture, warts and all. Or, in this case, dust, flies, and a distinct lack of indoor plumbing. It makes their accomplishments, from the pyramids to their sophisticated belief systems, even more mind-boggling, doesn't it? Because despite all the challenges, the heat, the lack of sanitation, the sheer physical toil, they built something truly eternal that you've likely seen the postcards, right? The majestic pyramids, the serene sphinx, the gleaming temples bathed in the golden light of dawn. They whisper tales of eternal grandeur, of a civilization so advanced, so utterly magnificent, that it feels almost otherworldly. And in many ways, it was. But lean in a little closer, past the polished granite and the painted murals, and you start to catch a whiff of something else entirely. Something less grand. Something that definitely wouldn't make it onto a luxury travel brochure. Because beneath that glittering facade, the daily reality for most ancient Egyptians was a relentless, often gruesome, battle against the invisible. Enemies of disease and the all-too-visible realities of unsanitary living. Imagine, if you will, stepping out of your humble mud brick dwelling in a bustling ancient Egyptian town. The sun is already beating down, heating the dusty air, and immediately, your senses are assaulted. It's not the crisp, clean air you might imagine wafting off the Nile. Oh no, it's a thick, heavy soup of smells. You breathe in the pervasive scent of unwashed bodies, of cooking fires mingling with the acrid tang of animal waste, and the unmistakable, sickly sweet odor of stagnant water. Open sewers, if you could even call them that, were more like open ditches running alongside the narrow, winding streets, collecting refuse from every household. You see flies, not just a few, but buzzing clouds of them, swarming over discarded food scraps, over the ubiquitous piles of animal dung, and unfortunately, over just about everything else. It's a constant, low hum of insect life, a symphony of potential infection just waiting to happen. Forget about your modern-day hand sanitizer. Here, cleanliness was less about hygiene and more about a general aspiration. You'd probably just learn to live with a perpetual layer of dust and grime, a kind of existential ancient Egyptian glitter. The very lifeline of Egypt, the magnificent Nile, was simultaneously its greatest blessing and its most insidious curse. While it provided the fertile soil, the transport, and the drinking water that sustained millions, it also served as the ultimate, unfiltered public toilet and dumping ground. Picture this. You draw your daily water from the river, the same river where people are bathing, washing clothes, animals are drinking, and, yes, where human and animal waste is routinely discharged. It's a multi-purpose waterway, to say the least. This constant, intimate contact with contaminated water meant that parasitic infections were not just common. They were practically universal. One of the most widespread and debilitating was schistosomiasis, also known as bilharzia. If you've ever wondered why so many ancient Egyptian mummies show evidence of organ damage, particularly in the bladder and intestines, this is your answer. You'd wade into the Nile, perhaps to irrigate your fields or simply to cool off, and microscopic larvae would burrow directly into your skin. Once inside, they'd mature into worms that would lay eggs in your internal organs, causing chronic inflammation, pain, and eventually, organ failure. It was a slow, agonizing process, and virtually no one escaped its grasp. It's truly a testament to their resilience that they managed to build anything at all, let alone massive monuments, while battling such an insidious internal foe. Beyond the water, the sheer density of population in towns and cities created ideal breeding grounds for disease. Housing was typically mud brick, often cramped and poorly ventilated. Imagine sharing a small, dark room with your extended family, livestock, sometimes housed nearby, and the constant presence of vermin, rats and mice, carriers of fleas and other pathogens, scurried through homes and granaries, while mosquitoes, thriving in the stagnant pools left by the Nile's floodwaters, delivered malaria with every bite. You'd constantly scratch at itchy welts, probably dismissing them as just another minor annoyance in a life full of them, unaware that each bite could be delivering a life-threatening illness. It makes you almost grateful for modern pest control, doesn't it? Though, to be fair, ancient Egypt probably had some truly massive fly swatters. Just a guess. The medical understanding of the time, while surprisingly advanced in some areas, like bone setting and basic surgery, was woefully lacking when it came to germ theory. They had no concept of microscopic organisms causing disease. Illness was often attributed to divine displeasure, evil spirits, or magical curses. So, while a physician might expertly set a broken limb, they'd also prescribe remedies that sound, to our modern ears, utterly bizarre. For instance, ancient Egyptian physicians sometimes recommended concoctions made from animal dung, believing it held curative properties. Yes, you heard that right. Poultices of moldy bread, an early, accidental form of penicillin, perhaps, or honey were common, but so were less palatable options. Imagine being sick, perhaps with a raging fever and dysentery, and being offered A remedy that involved, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly a pleasant-tasting cough syrup. It's a quirky tidbit that really highlights the vast difference in medical knowledge, but also the desperation to find anything that might work. Common ailments were relentless. Beyond the parasites, you faced a daily barrage of bacterial and viral infections. Dysentery, typhoid, and various diarrheal diseases were rampant, particularly among children, leading to high infant mortality rates. Smallpox, its telltale scars visible on the mummy of Pharaoh Ramses V, periodically swept through the population, leaving devastation in its wake. Tuberculosis, a chronic lung disease, was also widespread, its bony signatures found in skeletal remains. And then there were the eyes. Trachoma, a bacterial infection spread by flies, was endemic, causing widespread blindness and chronic irritation. You'd see people with inflamed, weeping eyes everywhere, a stark reminder of the ever-present threat to vision. It wasn't uncommon for people to simply accept failing eyesight as an inevitable part of aging, or even as a childhood affliction, rather than a treatable condition. The diet, while often sufficient in calories, could also contribute to health problems. A staple of bread and beer, yes, beer was a nutritious, low-alcohol daily drink, often safer than water, provided energy, but nutritional deficiencies were still common. Rickets, caused by a lack of vitamin D, led to bowed legs and weakened bones, especially in children. Anemia was also prevalent, likely due to parasitic infections and dietary imbalances. The constant physical labor, especially for those working in quarries or construction, also took a severe toll. Silicosis, a lung disease caused by inhaling stone dust, was a common occupational hazard for pyramid builders, slowly suffocating them as their lungs became scarred and hardened. Arthritis, from years of backbreaking work, would have been a near-universal complaint among the older population. It really makes you appreciate your ergonomic office chair, doesn't it? Though, I suppose the ancient Egyptians had their own version of a wellness retreat. It just probably involved more sand and less kombucha. Despite the existence of a medical profession and a surprisingly detailed understanding of anatomy, thanks to mummification, which we'll get to later, effective public health measures as we understand them today simply didn't exist. There were no municipal waste collection services, no widespread clean water infrastructure, no public hospitals in the modern sense. The elite might have enjoyed slightly better living conditions, perhaps larger homes with private latrines, but even they were not immune to the pervasive diseases carried by water, food, and insects. Pharaohs, despite their divine status, succumbed to the same parasites and infections as their lowliest subjects. It highlights a fundamental truth. In ancient Egypt, the grand monuments were built on the backs of people who lived in conditions that would make modern public health officials faint. Historians still argue whether the cyclical nature of the Nile floods, while essential for agriculture, exacerbated disease transmission by creating vast new breeding grounds for mosquitoes and other vectors, or if the annual cleansing effect of the floodwaters actually helped to wash away some pathogens. It's a complex interplay of factors, and the truth is likely somewhere in the middle. What is undeniable, however, is that life expectancy was significantly lower than today, often averaging around 30 to 35 years, with a high proportion of deaths occurring in infancy and childhood. Those who survived into old age were often burdened by chronic illness and physical ailments. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps consider the true cost of those magnificent temples and tombs. They stand as enduring testaments to human ingenuity and ambition, but they also whisper a hidden story of daily struggle, of relentless disease, and of a population constantly battling against unseen microscopic foes. It's a stark, gritty reality that adds a profound, human dimension to the glittering ancient world we often imagine. You find yourself drifting from the bustling, disease-ridden streets we just talked about, down a quieter, perhaps less savory alleyway. The air here hangs heavy, thick with a scent that's a strange, unsettling blend of spices, something metallic, and an undeniable, cloying sweetness that hints at decay. You're standing, or perhaps floating, at the threshold of what they called the Wabbit, the purification place, or more accurately, the embalming workshop. This isn't the gleaming, gold-laden tableau you see in museum exhibits. Oh no, this is the messy, visceral reality of death in ancient Egypt. Far from the polished sarcophagi and serene tomb paintings, imagine the heat, the flies, and the constant hum of activity, not of celebration, but of meticulous, grim work. You see a body, freshly deceased, laid out on a slanted slab, perhaps made of alabaster or stone, designed to let liquids drain away. The embalmers, often priests with specialized knowledge, move with a practiced, almost surgical precision, though. Their tools are nothing like the sterile instruments of today. Think flint knives, bronze hooks, long spatulas. These aren't the folks you'd invite to your dinner party, unless you had a very niche interest in anatomy and a strong stomach. The first step, and perhaps the most visually unsettling, is the brain. Yes, the brain. The Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of intelligence and emotion, the very core of a person's being, which is why it was almost always left in. The body. The brain, however, not so much. It was considered, well, largely useless for the afterlife. So out it came. You watch as an embalmer takes a long, thin bronze hook, sometimes tipped with iron, and carefully, painstakingly, inserts it up through one of the nostrils. You can almost feel the gentle scraping as the hook probes and then, with a series of twists and turns, begins to break up the delicate brain tissue inside the skull. It's a bit like trying to stir a thick milkshake with a very long straw. Only the milkshake is, once sufficiently macerated, the liquidized brain matter is allowed to drain out through the nostrils, sometimes with the assistance of the body being tilted or even shaken a little. Think of it as ancient Egyptian neurosurgery, only without the concern for the patient's consciousness. It sounds utterly barbaric to our modern ears, but to them, it was a practical necessity to prevent the brain from putrefying and causing the head to collapse during the drying process. Historians still argue whether this method was always employed for every single mummification, or if variations existed depending on the era or the status of the deceased. Some evidence suggests that for less affluent individuals, a caustic liquid might have been poured into the skull to dissolve the brain, which would then simply drain away. Either way, the end result was an empty, echoing cranial cavity. No brain, no problem, as far as the afterlife was concerned. Next, attention turns to the body cavity itself. You'll notice an incision, usually made on the left side of the abdomen, just below the ribs. This was often done by a specialized individual known as the slitter or opener, who, in a curious ritual, would make the cut and then immediately be ritually chased away, pelted with stones and curses. It seems they were performing a necessary but ritually impure act, even though it was vital for the deceased's journey to the afterlife. It's a bit like being the designated driver for a wild party, but then everyone throws fruit at you for having to do the boring bit. Through this incision, the embalmers would reach in and carefully, meticulously, remove most of the internal organs. We're talking the stomach, the intestines, the liver, and the lungs. Each organ was treated with immense respect, not discarded, but cleaned, dried, and then placed into what would become known as canopic jars. These beautifully crafted vessels, often made of alabaster, pottery, or limestone, had lids shaped like the heads of the four sons of Horus: Duamutef, jackal-headed, for the stomach; Hapi, baboon-headed, for the lungs; Imsidi, human-headed, for the liver; and Kabisanouf, falcon-headed, for the intestines. Imagine the smell in that workshop as these organs were handled, washed with palm wine and spices, then carefully bundled. It certainly wasn't the aromatic experience of a high-end spa. The heart, as we mentioned, was typically left in place. It was believed to be the seat of the soul, the core of one's being, essential for judgment in the afterlife. Removing it would be akin to deleting a person's entire hard drive before they could log into the great beyond. The kidneys, due to their deep position and small size, were also often left behind. Now, with the body cavity emptied, the true drying process could begin. This was the longest and arguably the most crucial phase. The body was completely covered, both inside and out, with natron. Natron is a naturally occurring salt, a mixture of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, and sodium sulfate, found in dry lake beds in Egypt. It's a powerful desiccant, meaning it sucks moisture. out like a sponge. You can almost feel the gritty texture as it's packed into every crevice, every fold of skin. The body would lie in this bed of natron for approximately 70 days. 70 days. Imagine the commitment. This wasn't a quick weekend project. During this time, the natron would slowly, relentlessly, draw all the water from the tissues, preventing decay. The body would shrivel, the skin would darken, and the features would become more gaunt. It's a bit like leaving a piece of fruit out in the sun for 2 months, only on a much grander, more solemn scale. The air in the workshop during this period must have been challenging. Even with the natron doing its job, the initial stages of decomposition would have left an unforgettable olfactory signature. Perhaps the embalmers developed a permanent sinus condition or just a very strong preference for incense. After 70 days, the shriveled, desiccated form of the deceased would be removed from the natron. The salt would be carefully brushed off, revealing the mummified remains. At this point, the body was incredibly fragile, almost brittle. To restore some semblance of its original form and prevent further damage, the embalmers would begin the process of packing. The empty body cavity, once home to vital organs, would be filled with various materials: linen pads, sawdust, sand, even onions, or bundles of aromatic resins. Sometimes, even small packets of the deceased's own hair or nail clippings were placed. Inside, perhaps as a final, intimate touch, it was all about creating a robust, recognizable vessel for the spirit's eternal journey. Then came the anointing. The body would be rubbed with precious oils, resins, and unguents. Myrrh, frankincense, cedar oil, these weren't just for fragrance. They had preservative qualities and were also ritually significant. The skin would regain a certain elasticity, a dark, lustrous sheen. This part of the process must have been a welcome relief from the earlier, more gruesome stages, a moment of almost artistic refinement. Finally, the wrapping. This is the stage most people associate with mummies, and for good reason. It was an incredibly elaborate, time-consuming, and skilled process. Thousands of yards of linen bandages, often torn from old clothes or fresh rolls, would be carefully wound around the body. Each limb was wrapped individually, then the entire body in layer upon layer. Between the layers, protective amulets and charms would be placed: scarabs for rebirth, wedged eyes for protection, ink symbols for life. These weren't just decorative. They were believed to magically safeguard the deceased on their perilous journey through the underworld. Imagine the sheer dedication involved. An average mummification for a high-status individual could involve hundreds of meters of linen applied with incredible precision. It was like wrapping the most important, sacred gift ever, ensuring every fold was perfect, every knot secure. It wasn't just about preservation, it was about transformation, about preparing a physical shell worthy of eternity. The whole process, from the first incision to the last bandaging, was steeped in religious ritual and prayer, ensuring the deceased was properly prepared for their eternal life. It's a testament to their unwavering belief in the afterlife that they went to such gruesome, gutsy lengths, transforming a decaying corpse into an immortal vessel. The glittering tombs and grand monuments might be the public face of ancient Egyptian death, but the true work, the messy, aromatic, deeply personal work, happened right here. In the Wabbit, you've just witnessed the messy, visceral reality of mummification, a process designed to defy decay. But imagine, if you will, a different kind of decay, a slow, insidious rot that crept not through flesh, but through the very bloodlines of Egypt's most sacred figures, the pharaohs themselves. You see, beneath the glittering crowns and the serene, idealized portraits, lay a rather uncomfortable truth, a secret kept in plain sight: royal incest. It was a practice so ingrained, so fundamental to their understanding of divinity, that it became a twisted legacy, leaving behind generations marked by deformities and fragile health. You might be thinking, wait, they married their siblings? Seriously? Oh, yes, dear listener, and not just occasionally, but with alarming regularity. You stand in the opulent chambers of a royal palace, the air thick with the scent of lotus blossoms and expensive oils, and you witness a wedding. But the bride, draped in fine linen and gold, is not a foreign princess or a noble from a distant province. She is the pharaoh's sister, sometimes even his half-sister, or, in more extreme cases, his daughter. Awkward family dinners. Anyone? If you thought your family reunions were awkward, try one where everyone looks eerily similar because, well, they are. The logic behind this practice, as bizarre as it seems to our modern sensibilities, was deeply rooted in their theology. The pharaoh was not merely a king. He was a living god, the son of Ra, the embodiment of Horus on earth. To dilute this divine essence with mortal, common blood was unthinkable. The purest blood was the most divine. And where do you find the purest blood? Why, within the family. Of course, they looked to their own pantheon for inspiration. The gods Osiris and Isis were siblings, yet they were also consorts, parents to Horus. If it was good enough for the gods, it was certainly good enough for the pharaohs. So, you see, it wasn't just about keeping power within the family, though that was certainly a bonus. It was about maintaining an unbroken, undiluted connection to the heavens. It was literally keeping it all in the family, but with cosmic implications. Yet, while it might have preserved their perceived divinity, it certainly didn't preserve their DNA. You might recall learning about genetics in school, about recessive genes, dominant genes, and the perils of a shallow gene pool. Well, ancient Egypt was a masterclass in what happens when you ignore those lessons for millennia. As the generations piled up, the consequences of this relentless inbreeding began to manifest. You picture the grand processions the pharaoh carried aloft, adored by his subjects. But look closer. Do you see the slight limp? The unusually shaped skull? The delicate, almost brittle frame? These weren't always just artistic stylizations. Sometimes, they were very real genetic markers. Take, for instance, the most famous boy king of all, Tutankhamun. When you think of King Tut, you probably imagine the golden mask, the immense wealth, the mystique of his untouched tomb. But beneath that golden veneer lay a young man plagued by ill health. Recent scientific analyses, including DNA studies, of his mummy and those of his family, have painted a rather tragic picture. You learn that his parents were full siblings. Yes, his father, Akhenaten, was married to his sister, who was also his mother. Talk about a complicated family tree. This extreme level of inbreeding led to a litany of health problems for Tutankhamun. You can almost hear the soft creak of his bones as he walks, feeling the constant ache. He suffered from a severe club foot, which would have made walking incredibly painful, necessitating the use of canes. Indeed, over 130 walking sticks were found in his tomb. He also had bone necrosis, a condition where bone tissue dies due to a lack of blood supply, likely in his left foot. Malaria was also found in his system. So, you imagine this young pharaoh, not as an invincible god-king, but as a frail, often sickly teenager, struggling with pain and weakness. He was a walking testament to the grim realities of a fragile bloodline, and Tutankhamun wasn't an isolated case. You might consider his father, Akhenaten, the revolutionary pharaoh who tried to shift Egypt to monotheism. His depictions are famously unusual: elongated skull, narrow face, wide hips, and a somewhat feminine physique. For centuries, historians and art enthusiasts have debated whether these were purely artistic choices, reflecting a new aesthetic, or if they were literal representations of physical deformities brought on by generations of inbreeding. Some scholars have suggested he might have suffered from conditions like Marfan syndrome or Froelich syndrome, both of which can lead to such physical characteristics. Imagine the hushed whispers in the royal court, the discreet glances as the pharaoh passed, his unusual figure a subject of both awe and quiet speculation. Perhaps the ancient Egyptian artists were just being really honest in their depictions. Bless their hearts. The consequences weren't just physical deformities, though those were certainly visible. You consider the broader implications for the bloodline itself. Fragile bloodlines often mean reduced fertility, higher rates of miscarriage, and increased infant mortality. While hard evidence for these specific outcomes in ancient Egyptian royalty is difficult to ascertain from the archaeological record alone, it stands to reason that a severely restricted gene pool would lead to a general weakening of health and vitality across generations. You might imagine the immense pressure on royal women to produce heirs, only for many of those children to be born with severe health issues or to die young, further exacerbating the problem of succession. Every birth was a gamble, every healthy child a minor miracle against the odds of their own genetic inheritance. The practice of royal incest wasn't unique to Egypt, mind you. You find echoes of it in other ancient civilizations, often for similar reasons of maintaining purity or consolidating power. But in Egypt, it was elevated to an almost sacred duty, a direct emulation of the gods. And this wasn't just limited to the pharaoh and his great royal wife. Sometimes, a pharaoh would marry his own daughters to further solidify his claim, or to ensure that any potential heir had an even more direct, undiluted connection to his divine essence. You might think of it as a very exclusive, very complicated club where the membership requirements were, shall we say, a little too close to home. You might wonder, did they know it was causing problems? Did they connect the dots between their family trees and their children's ailments? It's impossible to say for certain. Their understanding of biology and genetics was, of course, vastly different from ours. They attributed sickness and misfortune to divine displeasure or malevolent magic, not to recessive genes. So, while they might have observed the physical frailties, they likely interpreted them through a lens of spirituality and fate, rather than a scientific understanding of heredity. They were doing what they believed was necessary to maintain cosmic order and their own divine status. One quirky tidbit about this practice is how the title King's Sister became a highly prestigious title for a royal woman, regardless of whether she was literally the pharaoh's sister by birth. It signified her elevated status, her proximity to the divine power of the pharaoh, and often indicated she was a potential candidate for a great royal wife. This shows how deeply ingrained the concept of sibling marriage was in their royal ideology, even influencing titles and social standing beyond direct lineage. It was a cultural norm at the highest echelons of society. Historians still argue whether the physical ailments and deformities observed in mummified royals like Tutankhamun were solely due to inbreeding, or if other factors like infectious diseases, malaria, tuberculosis, etc., and the general unsanitary conditions of the time played an equally significant, if not greater, role in their overall health. Pinpointing the exact cause of death or specific ailments from ancient remains is always a complex endeavor, but the genetic evidence for inbreeding is undeniably strong. The debate often centers on the extent of its impact versus other environmental factors. As you drift deeper into the secrets of ancient Egypt, you begin to see that their glittering facade was not just hiding practical, earthly realities, but also the very human vulnerabilities of their god-kings. The pursuit of divine purity, ironically, led to a physical fragility that would eventually contribute to the decline of some dynasties. The very effort to elevate themselves beyond mortality sometimes left them tragically, visibly, and painfully human. You reflect on the silent suffering of these pharaohs, cloaked in gold and divinity, yet carrying within them the genetic burdens of their ancestors, a silent testament to a twisted legacy that you've marveled at the golden sarcophagi pictured, the gleaming temples, and maybe even imagine the pharaohs lounging on silken cushions, fanned by exotic plumes. But now let's pull back the curtain, shall we? Let's leave the gilded halls and descend into the swirling dust of everyday life for the vast majority of ancient Egyptians. Forget your ergonomic office chairs and your artisanal sourdough. For these folks, life was less about work-life balance and more about work till you drop and then work some more. Imagine, if you will, waking before the sun even thought about gracing the horizon. No gentle alarm clock here, just the insistent crow of a rooster, or perhaps the distant bleating of a goat. Your bed is likely a simple mat on the packed earth floor of a small, mud-brick dwelling. It's cramped, probably shared with several family members, and the air is thick with the smell of wood smoke from the cooking fire, a hint of stale beer, and the ever-present dust. As you stretch, every muscle in your body probably aches from the previous day's exertions. This isn't a restorative yoga kind of stretch. It's the groan of a body already pushed to its limits. Your morning coffee is a mug of thick, often lukewarm, beer. Yes, beer. Not the craft IPAs you might enjoy, but a nutritious, low-alcohol brew that served as a staple of the Egyptian diet, providing calories and hydration. And breakfast? Probably a hunk of coarse bread, perhaps some onions or a date. No fancy avocado. Toast here, just the fuel you need to face another relentless day under the unforgiving Egyptian sun. And speaking of the sun, you're already feeling the heat, even before it's fully risen. It's a dry, pervasive heat that saps your energy even as you simply stand there. For most Egyptians, life revolved around the Nile, not just for transportation or drinking water, but as the very lifeblood of their existence. You are, in all likelihood, a farmer. Your hands are calloused, your back perpetually stooped. You spend your days toiling in the fields, waiting for the annual inundation, the flooding of the Nile, which, for thousands of years, brought fertile silt to rejuvenate the land. This was your make-or-break moment. Too much flood, and your village could be swept away. Too little, and famine loomed. It was a constant, nerve-wracking gamble with nature. You trudged through the mud, perhaps driving a simple wooden plow pulled by oxen, or perhaps simply using a hoe, turning the earth by hand. You plant barley and emmer wheat, the grains that will become your daily bread and beer. You irrigate the fields, painstakingly lifting water from canals using a shaduf, a counterbalance pole with a bucket, a task that would make your shoulders scream in protest after just a few minutes, let alone an entire day. Imagine that. Rhythmic, repetitive movement, hour after hour, under a sky so clear it seems to mock your sweat. And then there are the pests. Locusts, rodents, birds, all conspiring to devour your precious harvest. You shout, you wave, you try to scare them away, but some always get through. It's a constant battle, a race against time and nature too. Secure enough food for your family, and, crucially, enough to pay your taxes to the state. Because, let's not forget, everything you grow, everything you produce, is ultimately for the pharaoh and his vast administration. You are, in essence, a cog in a gigantic, sun-baked machine. But what if you weren't a farmer? Perhaps you were a laborer. And by laborer, we mean the kind of back-breaking, sweat-drenched work that would make a modern gym junkie weep. You might be quarrying stone, chipping away at solid rock with bronze chisels and stone hammers, dust filling your lungs with every swing. You might be dragging colossal blocks of stone across the desert, using nothing but ropes, wooden rollers, and sheer human muscle. Think about the pyramids, the temples, the colossal statues. They weren't built by magic or by highly advanced machinery. They were built by millions of hands like yours, straining and grunting under the watchful eyes of overseers. There were no safety regulations, no union breaks, no take 5. If a block slipped, if a rope snapped, if a wall collapsed, well, that was just another body added to the silent, uncounted casualties of empire building. Your life expectancy wasn't exactly stellar. Infections from minor cuts could turn deadly. Broken bones often healed badly, if at all, and a simple fever could quickly escalate into something fatal. Historians still argue whether the common Egyptian truly felt a deep, personal connection to the pharaoh as a divine being, or if their participation in these monumental projects was more a pragmatic acceptance of an inescapable obligation, a way to avoid starvation, or worse. It's a good question, isn't it? Were they building for glory or just for survival? Your home, a simple mud brick structure, offered little respite. It was cool inside, a blessing from the sun, but also dark and often smoky. Furnishings were minimal: a few mats, some pottery vessels for cooking and storage, perhaps a wooden stool or two. Personal hygiene was basic. You'd wash in the Nile, or with water carried from it. But communal living and the lack of proper sanitation meant that parasites and diseases were rampant. Imagine the constant battle against fleas, lice, and the ever-present flies. It was a losing battle. Most days, meals were monotonous. Bread, beer, onions, garlic, lentils, and a few other vegetables like lettuce or cucumbers were your staples. Meat was a luxury, reserved for special occasions or the wealthy. Fish from the Nile was a more common source of protein, but even that depended on your location and access. And those teeth? Oh, those poor teeth. The coarse grains used for bread often contained grit from the grinding stones, slowly but surely, wearing down enamel and leading to painful abscesses and tooth loss. So, while you might not have had a dentist, you certainly had a lot of cavities. The ancient Egyptians, despite their advanced medicine in some areas, really suffered when it came to their dental health. It's a quirky little fact that their bread literally chipped away at their smiles. Entertainment was simple. Storytelling around the fire, perhaps a game of Senate, a board game that's a bit like an ancient version of checkers or the occasional festival. There were no Netflix binges, no TikTok scrolls. Your social media was literally talking to your neighbors in the dust outside your house. Children played with simple toys, clay animals, wooden dolls, their innocence a stark contrast to the harsh realities awaiting them as adults. And remember those taxes? They weren't just in grain. You were also expected to contribute your labor, corvée labor, to state projects. This meant leaving your fields, your family, and your meager income to work on temples, canals, or quarries for weeks or even months at a time. It was essentially forced labor, but framed as a civic duty. You were, in effect, rented out by the state, your body and strength the ultimate commodity. This was the fundamental engine of the Egyptian economy and the bedrock of its monumental achievements. No wonder they called it the land of monuments. They certainly had plenty of free labor to build them. Social mobility was incredibly limited. You were born into your station, and that was likely where you would stay. The son of a farmer became a farmer. The daughter of a weaver became a weaver. While there were rare instances of individuals rising through the ranks, perhaps becoming a scribe or an overseer, for the vast majority, their destiny was etched in the mud and dust of their daily grind. Your purpose was to serve the state, to provide food, and to contribute your physical strength to the glory of the pharaoh. It wasn't exactly the follow your dreams ethos we hear so much about today. More like follow the plow or starve. So, as you drift off, perhaps you can appreciate the quiet comfort of your own bed, the ease of access to clean water, and the simple fact that your teeth probably aren't being ground down by your morning toast. The glittering facade of ancient Egypt was magnificent, yes, but for most, it was built on a foundation of relentless, backbreaking, and often brutal daily toil. A truly grim daily grind indeed. You might, like many, harbor a mental image of ancient Egypt's grandest achievements, those towering pyramids, the colossal temples, the intricate tombs, as the product of untold masses of enslaved people toiling under the relentless lash of a taskmaster. It's a powerful, persistent image, etched into our collective consciousness by Hollywood blockbusters and popular lore. But as we peel back the shimmering layers of this ancient civilization, you begin to see a truth that is perhaps more nuanced, yet no less uncomfortable. The monumental legacy of Egypt was indeed built on widespread forced labor, a system integral to its very existence, even if the term slavery doesn't quite capture the full, complex picture of its mechanisms. Imagine, if you will, the scorching Egyptian sun beating down on your brow, the kind of heat that makes the very air shimmer above the desert sands. You stand, not as a tourist marveling at the wonders, but as one of the countless individuals whose sweat and sinew literally raised these wonders from the earth. The vast majority of the people contributing to these epic construction projects weren't what you'd typically envision as chattel slaves, bought and sold like property, owning nothing, with no rights whatsoever. Instead, you'd likely be part of a system known as corvée labor. Think of it less as enslavement and more as a mandatory state service, a kind of labor tax. Every able-bodied man, and sometimes women, owed a certain amount of time to the pharaoh, to the state, to the gods, in the form of physical work. It was like a very, very demanding national service, without the fancy uniform or the promise of a decent pension. Your HR department, in ancient Egypt, was less about benefits packages and more about making sure you showed up with a strong back. So, who were these millions of hands that shaped the landscape? You'd find a diverse group, though all sharing the common thread of compelled participation. Farmers, for instance, comprised a huge segment. When the annual inundation of the Nile swallowed their fields, rendering agricultural work impossible, for several months, they weren't exactly given a paid vacation. Oh no. Instead, they were conscripted, directed by royal decree to join the ranks of the pyramid builders, the temple constructors, the quarrymen, or the canal diggers. Imagine your annual leave being spent hauling colossal stones, instead of, say, a relaxing week in Sharm el-Sheikh. It certainly puts a different spin on working from home, doesn't it? Alongside these seasonal conscripts, you'd also find skilled craftsmen, masons, carpenters, sculptors, artists, who, while perhaps enjoying a slightly better standard of living and more specialized tasks, were still bound by the state's demands. Then there were prisoners of war, captured in Egypt's various military campaigns, who were often treated more akin to traditional slaves, assigned the most brutal and dangerous tasks. Convicted criminals, too, would find themselves condemned to hard labor, their sentences served under the unforgiving sun, perhaps dragging blocks of granite or crushing or in dusty mines. You might also encounter individuals who, unable to pay their debts, essentially sold their labor, or even their family's labor, for a period of time, a desperate measure to survive in a society with little social safety net. Your daily life as a corvée laborer would be a symphony of exhaustion. You'd wake with the sun, the air already thick with dust, and the murmur of thousands of voices. The work was relentless, often dangerous. If you were quarrying stone, you'd be wielding heavy tools, chipping away at rock faces, the rhythmic clang of hammer on chisel echoing across the barren landscape. If you were transporting those massive blocks, you'd be part of a vast human chain, pulling ropes, pushing levers, your muscles screaming in protest with every inch gained. The sheer physical toll would be immense. Accidents were common: falling stones, collapsing ramps, heat stroke, injuries from crude tools. Medical care, while surprisingly advanced for the time, was certainly no modern emergency room. A broken bone could mean a lifetime of disability, or worse. Your diet would be basic, but generally sufficient to fuel such demanding work. Archaeological discoveries at the workers' villages near the Giza pyramids, for example, have revealed evidence of a remarkably well-organized supply system. You'd likely receive rations of bread, beer, a staple, even for children, offering hydration and calories, onions, and occasional fish or meat. It wasn't exactly gourmet dining, but it was enough to keep you going, unlike the starvation diets often depicted in fiction. This is where a mainstream historical fact comes into play. The workers who built the Great Pyramids of Giza, particularly during the Old Kingdom, were largely free citizens, organized into highly structured teams, provided with food, housing, and even basic medical care, rather than a vast, enslaved population as commonly believed. They lived in purpose-built settlements, complete with bakeries, breweries, and even cemeteries where their remains show evidence of healed fractures, indicating medical attention. Yet, even with organized provisions and some level of care, the work was still forced. You couldn't just decide you'd rather spend the day carving hieroglyphs than hauling stone. The overseers, identifiable by their staffs and often their more comfortable attire, would ensure discipline. Beatings were not uncommon for shirking or disobedience. The system relied on a potent blend of religious obligation. Working for the pharaoh was working for a living god, and the very real threat of physical punishment, and sometimes, just sometimes, the pressure would build to a breaking point. You might hear whispers among your fellow laborers, a grumble about delayed rations or unfair treatment. And then, something quite remarkable might happen. Consider the quirky tidbit from the New Kingdom, at the village of Deir el-Medina, home to the artisans who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. In the 29th year of Ramesses III's reign, around 1159 BCE, these highly skilled, relatively privileged workers, whose job was to ensure the pharaoh's eternal resting place was perfect, actually went on strike. They stopped work, sat down, and refused to move until their overdue grain rations were delivered. Imagine that, a labor dispute, complete with a sit-down protest, in ancient Egypt. They even shouted, "We are hungry." It was a rare, fascinating glimpse into the collective power of labor, even within a highly autocratic system. Their demands were eventually met, proving that even the mighty pharaoh's projects could grind to a halt if the workers weren't adequately compensated. This brings us to a fundamental point of contention among scholars today, and it's a phrase you'll hear often in academic circles when discussing this topic. Historians still argue whether the term slavery truly encapsulates the full spectrum of forced labor in ancient Egypt, or if state-mandated corvée is a more accurate, albeit still grim, descriptor. The debate hinges on definitions. Was it chattel slavery, where individuals were property without rights, or was it a form of forced civic duty, a tax paid in sweat, where individuals still retained some legal personhood. Regardless of the precise terminology, the underlying truth remains. The vast majority of Egyptians, from the lowliest farmer to the most skilled artisan, had little choice but to contribute their labor to the grand projects of the state. Your life, your very existence, was inextricably linked to the pharaoh's will and the demands of the gods he represented. As you drift off, consider the sheer scale of this human endeavor. Not just the pyramids, but every temple, every obelisk, every canal that brought water to the fields, every stone carved with hieroglyphs, every military road. All were built on the backs of millions through a system that, while perhaps not slavery in its most absolute, dehumanizing form, was undeniably coercive. It was a world where individual freedom, as we understand it, was a rare and precious commodity, often sacrificed at the altar of monumental ambition. The glittering facade of Egypt's golden age was indeed built on an uncomfortable foundation of relentless, mandatory toil. Now, as you drift further into the whispered past, let's peel back another layer of that gilded Egyptian veneer, moving from the relentless grind of labor to the even harsher reality of their justice system. Imagine, if you will, a world where the concept of innocent until proven guilty was less a cornerstone and more a distant, unheard of whisper carried on the desert wind. Here, justice was often swift, public, and delivered with a chilling efficiency. That would make modern legal reformers gasp. You find yourself in a bustling market square, the air thick with the scent of spices, dust, and something else, a palpable tension. You see the curious glances, the hushed conversations, and then the slow, deliberate procession. This isn't just a daily marketplace. It's also the stage for ancient Egypt's grim theater of law. For the vast majority of Egyptians, their daily lives were governed by a legal framework that, while aiming for order, was profoundly unforgiving. Minor disputes, like a squabble over irrigation rights or a stolen tool, might be handled by the local kinbet, a council of elders or community leaders. You'd bring your grievance, perhaps a neighbor accusing you of letting your goats wander into their carefully tended vegetable patch, and these local wise men would listen, deliberate, and issue a judgment. Simple, direct, and often based on community consensus rather than elaborate legal codes. But then, you start to hear whispers of more serious matters. Theft, for instance, was a pervasive problem in a society where wealth was concentrated and poverty widespread. A stolen loaf of bread could land you in serious trouble, but a more significant theft, say, of grain from a granary, or, even worse, valuable items from a private home, could lead to truly brutal consequences. The legal system, though seemingly complex with its various levels of courts and scribes recording proceedings, ultimately served the pharaoh and the established order. At the top of this judicial pyramid sat the vizier, the pharaoh's right hand, who served as the supreme judge, overseeing the entire legal system. This was no small task. The vizier was essentially the chief justice, minister of agriculture, treasurer, and head of public works all rolled into one, a truly busy individual, as you can imagine. And what about proving your case? Evidence was often based on witness testimony and oaths sworn before the gods. Imagine the weight of that, not just lying to a human, but to Osiris himself. Perjury, therefore, was taken incredibly seriously. If you were caught lying under oath, the consequences could be dire, often involving physical mutilation as a public mark of your dishonesty. You might find yourself with your tongue cut out, or perhaps your nose, a stark and permanent reminder of your transgression. No endless appeals, no pesky legal aid, just results. Efficient, if nothing else, right? Beyond the local kinbet and the vizier's grand court, there was another fascinating and perhaps unsettling avenue for justice, the divine oracle. Yes, you heard that right. Sometimes, particularly when human judgment seemed impossible or insufficient, disputes were taken to the gods themselves. You'd go to a temple, perhaps with your accuser, and present your case to the statue of a deity. Priests would then interpret the god's will, often through the movement of the statue, a nod, a turn, a subtle shift. Imagine your fate decided by a bobbing boat or a grunting bull whose movements were interpreted by a priest. Forget lawyers, you sometimes needed a good animal whisperer, This quirky tidbit highlights a fascinating blend of the rational and the mystical in their pursuit of order. But let's not sugarcoat it. The justice part often came hand in hand with cruelty. For lesser offenses, you might face a good old-fashioned flogging. You see the public whipping posts, the crowds gathered, the crack of the whip echoing across the square. It's not just about pain. It's about humiliation, a stark warning to anyone else contemplating a similar misstep. For repeat offenders or more serious crimes, the punishments escalated dramatically. Forced labor, often in the brutal conditions of distant mines or quarries, was a common sentence. You'd be sent away, effectively condemned to a slow death from exhaustion and deprivation, your body breaking under the unforgiving sun. This wasn't the organized forced labor for monument building. Mind you, this was a sentence, a punishment designed to extract every last ounce of your strength. Then you hear whispers of the truly horrific. Mutilation, as mentioned, was not uncommon. Losing a hand for repeated theft, an ear for insubordination. These were not simply acts of vengeance. They were indelible brands, marking you forever as a criminal, an outcast. You'd bear the physical scars, but also the social stigma, a constant reminder of your past misdeeds. And for the most egregious offenses, particularly those against the state or the pharaoh, the ultimate punishment awaited, death. Executions were not hidden away. Oh no, they were public spectacles, designed to instill fear and reinforce the pharaoh's absolute authority. You might witness decapitation, a swift end for traitors or those who conspired against the throne. But there were other, more agonizing methods. Though not explicitly detailed in every historical record, there are hints of impalement for particularly heinous crimes, a slow, torturous death. And for sacrilege or treason of the highest order, burning alive was not unheard of, a terrifying purification by fire. Imagine the collective gasp of the crowd, the smell of smoke, the chilling silence that would follow such a gruesome display. A public spectacle, certainly, far more engaging than, say, waiting in line for bread. Unless, of course, you were the main attraction, in which case, perhaps less engaging and more enduring. Treason, in particular, was met with unbridled fury. Conspiring against the pharaoh was the ultimate crime, an affront to the divine order itself. The infamous harem conspiracy against Ramesses III is a chilling example. The conspirators, even high-ranking officials and members of the royal harem, faced not only execution but also, in some cases, a unique form of posthumous punishment, damnatio memoriae, the erasure of one's memory. Your name would be chiseled out of monuments, your images defaced, your very existence wiped from the historical record. In a culture obsessed with eternal life and remembrance, this was a fate arguably worse than death, condemning you to non-existence in both this world and the next. Historians still debate the true extent of torture and whether it was systematically applied beyond high-profile cases. While not a routine judicial process in the way we understand it, the extraction of confessions, particularly in politically charged trials, certainly involved brutal methods. Imagine the pressure, the pain, the desperation to confess to anything, to make it stop. It paints a picture far removed from the serene, golden images of temples and tombs. Even the dead were not safe from the long arm of ancient Egyptian justice, or rather, from the crimes committed against them. Tomb robbery, a persistent scourge that we'll delve into more deeply later, was a capital offense. If caught, you weren't just facing flogging or forced labor. You were likely facing death, often by impalement or burning, a stark warning to others who might consider violating the sacred resting places of the deceased. The fear of divine retribution and earthly punishment was meant to protect the treasures of the afterlife, though, as you'll discover, it often failed thus so. As you slowly close your eyes and let these images fade, remember the ancient Egyptian legal system, a brutal, often public, and remarkably unforgiving machine designed to maintain order at any cost. It was a world where a simple accusation could lead to a swift and painful end, where the gods themselves might weigh in on your fate, and where the line between justice and vengeance was often blurred. It's a stark reminder that beneath the grandeur of the pyramids and the elegance of their art lay a foundational layer of fear, strict control, and often profound human suffering that you've trudged through the muck of ancient plagues, winced at the ghastly goo of mummification, and perhaps even shuddered at the thought of royal inbreeding. But now, as the night deepens and your eyelids grow heavy, let's tiptoe into another corner of Egypt's less than sparkling reality, its intimate life. Because, believe it or not, even the bedroom, that most private of spaces, held its own set of filthy secrets and surprisingly candid norms, far removed from the stiff, stone-faced pharaohs you see in museums. Imagine, if you will, a society where discussing sex wasn't quite the hushed, awkward affair it often became in later, more prudish cultures. The ancient Egyptians, bless their sun-baked souls, were remarkably open about the physical side of life. For them, creation itself, the very act of the world coming into being, was often depicted in highly sexual terms. The sun god Ra, for instance, was sometimes said to have ejaculated the first gods into existence. Now, that's a creation story with some oomph, wouldn't you say? It sets the tone, doesn't it? Sex wasn't just for procreation. It was a fundamental, natural, and even divine force, intrinsically linked to fertility, rebirth, and the rhythm of the Nile itself. You see this openness reflected everywhere, from their vibrant love poetry to their art. Forget your modern dating apps. Ancient Egyptians had passionate verses that would make your heart flutter or blush, depending on the line. These aren't your typical flowery, chaste sonnets. Oh no, they speak of longing, of bodies intertwining, of desire that burns like the desert sun. One poem might describe a lover's beauty, while another explicitly details a rendezvous in a garden, with all the sensual details you could imagine. It's a far cry from the stiff, formal images we usually conjure when we think of ancient Egypt, isn't it? It reminds you that underneath the linen and the gold, these were real people with real desires, just like us. Perhaps even more so, given the lack of late-night Netflix and chill options. Marriage was, of course, a cornerstone of society, primarily for the purpose of establishing a household and producing heirs. But it wasn't just a transactional affair. Companionship and love were highly valued. You see this in tomb paintings where husbands and wives are depicted embracing, holding hands, or simply sitting together in quiet affection. The wife, known as the mistress of the house, or Nebetper, held a surprisingly strong position, managing the household, the finances, and often even engaging in business ventures. And here's a mainstream historical fact for you. Unlike many contemporary societies, ancient Egyptian women had remarkably extensive legal rights, including the right to own property, inherit, and even initiate divorce. Imagine that a woman in ancient Egypt could divorce her husband and take her property with her. It makes you wonder if some modern legal systems have actually gone backwards in certain respects. Speaking of divorce, it was a relatively straightforward process for both men and women. There was no complex religious ceremony to undo. A simple agreement, often with financial stipulations, was enough. This flexibility in marital arrangements also extended to family planning. Yes, even in ancient Egypt, people were thinking about contraception. They weren't exactly popping pills, but they had their methods. Ancient medical texts describe various concoctions and pessaries made from ingredients like acacia gum, honey, or even crocodile dung mixed with sour milk. The acacia gum, when fermented, produces lactic acid, which we now know has spermicidal properties. So, while perhaps not 100% effective, they were certainly trying, which is a fascinating glimpse into their proactive approach to bodily autonomy, even thousands of years ago. It's a quirky little tidbit that reminds you just how resourceful and innovative they could be, even with, well, let's just say unconventional ingredients. Now, let's talk about how they showed it. While much of their art is formal and symbolic, there are instances where sexuality is quite explicit, especially when linked to fertility. Take, for example, the god Men. You often see him depicted with an erect phallus, holding a flail, and sometimes lettuce. Lettuce, you ask? Yes, lettuce was considered an aphrodisiac and a symbol of fertility. Men was the god of fertility, harvest, and male potency. His image, often prominently displayed, was not seen as scandalous but as a powerful symbol of life-giving force. It's like their version of a fertility statue, only a bit more direct But what about non-traditional relationships? This is where the historical record gets a little hazy and the debates begin. We know royal incest was a peculiar, divinely sanctioned practice for pharaohs to maintain their pure bloodlines. But for commoners, it was definitely not the norm and was likely taboo. When it comes to same-sex relationships, the evidence is scarce and open to multiple interpretations. There are a few instances, like the tomb of Khnumhotep and Nyanknum, two male court officials from the Old Kingdom, who are depicted in an embrace that could be interpreted as intimate. They are even shown in a nose-kissing pose, which was typically reserved for spouses. However, historians still argue whether this reflects a socially accepted same-sex relationship, a unique familial bond, or simply a symbolic representation of their close professional partnership. It's a classic case of ancient ambiguity, leaving us to wonder if they were just really good friends or something more. The truth, like so many secrets of ancient Egypt, remains tantalizingly out of reach, shrouded in the sands of time and academic debate. But what about the truly hidden world, the commercial side of intimacy? The ancient equivalent of the red light district? This is where the sources become even more elusive, hinting at a world that existed but was rarely officially acknowledged. You won't find explicit tax records for ancient Egyptian brothels, for instance. Prostitution, as a formal, recognized profession, doesn't appear in official texts. However, that doesn't mean it didn't exist. Like many societies throughout history, ancient Egypt likely had its share of sex workers, operating in the shadows, or perhaps more openly in certain contexts. Where would you find such services? Think about the places where people gathered, where strangers passed through, and where social norms might be a little looser. Harbors, for one. Sailors, merchants, and travelers, far from home and the watchful eyes of their families, would have been prime clientele. Taverns, or houses of beer, were also likely hotspots. These establishments were more than just places to grab a drink. They were social hubs, places for entertainment, and quite possibly, discreet meeting points. Imagine a smoky, dimly lit room, the smell of fermented barley and sweat, the drone of conversations, and perhaps a musician playing a lute. It's not hard to picture a clandestine exchange taking place in such a setting. Some scholars have suggested the existence of sacred prostitution linked to temples, but this is highly debated and largely unsubstantiated in Egypt, unlike in some other ancient Near Eastern cultures. It seems more likely that any such activity near temples would have been opportunistic rather than ritualistic. The filth here isn't just about the physical act, but the social strata involved. These individuals, often women, would have been on the fringes of society, perhaps driven to such work by poverty or lack of other options. Their lives would have been precarious, their social standing low, even if the general attitude towards sex wasn't puritanical. It's a stark reminder that even in a society that celebrated fertility, economic realities could push individuals into difficult circumstances. And, of course, where there's commercial intimacy, there are health implications. While ancient Egyptians had sophisticated medical knowledge for their time, they certainly wouldn't have understood sexually transmitted infections in the way we do today. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other STIs likely existed, causing suffering and illness. But without the benefit of modern antibiotics or diagnostic tools, these conditions would have been a part of the hidden filth of their intimate lives, contributing to disease and discomfort, just like the parasites and plagues we discussed earlier. It's a sobering thought, adding another layer of grim reality to the daily lives of some Egyptians. So, as you drift off, consider this. Ancient Egypt, for all its monumental grandeur and divine kings, was also a place where human desires and frailties played out in ways both familiar and alien. It was a place where love poetry could be explicit, where women had surprising rights, and where, despite the silence of official records, the oldest profession likely thrived in the shadows of taverns and bustling ports. It reminds us that humanity, in all its messy, passionate, and sometimes precarious forms, is truly timeless, that you've probably drifted off to sleep imagining the grand pyramids, the golden masks, and perhaps even the soothing, rhythmic lapping of the Nile against the banks of papyrus reeds. But now, let's pull back the curtain on a less serene aspect of ancient Egyptian life, one that hums with a more unsettling energy. their profound, unwavering belief in dark magic and the bone-chilling power of dreadful curses. Forget your cozy, modern notions of magic tricks. For the Egyptians, Heka, as they called it, wasn't parlor entertainment. It was a fundamental, living force, as real and tangible as the desert sand beneath your sandals, and it permeated every single crevice of their existence. It was their science, their medicine, their justice, and their ultimate weapon against the unknown. Imagine, if you will, that the air you breathe isn't just oxygen and nitrogen, but also a swirling, invisible current of magical energy. That's how the ancient Egyptians perceived their world. Every illness, every misfortune, every unexplained anomaly could be attributed to malevolent forces, vengeful spirits, or the ill wishes of a rival. And the only counterforce, the only way to bend reality to your will, was Heka. You weren't just treating a headache. You were banishing the demon that caused it. You weren't just hoping for a good harvest. You were ritually compelling the gods to grant it. It was a cosmic game of chess, and they were always playing. Who were the grandmasters of this arcane game? Well, everyone really. While priests and specialized lector priests were the official practitioners, scribes often copied magical texts, and even ordinary folk possessed their own collection of protective amulets and simple charms. If you had a problem, chances are you'd turn to a magician, or perhaps even try a spell yourself from a papyrus scroll, much like you might Google a home remedy today. Except, instead of a lemon and honey concoction, you might be instructed to recite an incantation over a strange brew of herbs, animal parts. Don't ask, darling, it's bedtime. And perhaps a few drops of something decidedly unappetizing. It makes you wonder how many ancient Egyptian children got their vegetables by being told it was magic potion for bravery. The purposes of this magic were as varied as the stars in the desert sky. On the protective side, you'd find spells to ward off scorpions, snake bites, and the ever-present threat of crocodiles lurking in the Nile. Imagine trudging home after a long day in the fields, the sun dipping below the horizon, and whispering a protective charm against unseen river predators. You'd wear amulets shaped like scarab beetles for rebirth, the Ankh for life, or the Eye of Horus for protection and healing. These weren't just pretty trinkets. They were active, potent shields, imbued with Heka, guarding your very soul. You might even find a spell to stop a baby from crying, which I imagine was probably the most frequently requested magical service, right up there with "Make my neighbor's donkey stop braying at dawn." Healing magic was intertwined with their medical practices. When you visited a physician, he might prescribe a poultice, but he'd also likely recite an incantation to expel the illness, identifying the disease as a malevolent entity or a curse. You'd find spells for everything from toothaches to broken bones, often involving elaborate rituals that combined practical remedies with mystical words. It was holistic healthcare, ancient Egyptian style, with a generous side of supernatural intervention. But then, we venture into the darker alleys of Heka. Not all magic was about protection and healing. Much of it was about influence, and indeed, destruction. Love spells, for instance, were surprisingly common. Imagine a young Egyptian, smitten by a love interest, painstakingly inscribing their name on a clay figurine or preparing a magical ointment, hoping to ignite passion or perhaps, more sinisterly, to compel affection. These weren't exactly rom-com meet cuties. They were more like ancient Egyptian versions of a very aggressive dating app, with less swiping and more chanting. And then there are the curses. Oh, the curses. The Egyptians didn't just wish their enemies ill, they manifested it. One of the most chilling examples is the execration texts. These were pottery shards or small clay figurines, often depicting bound captives, on which the names of enemies of the state, rebellious tribes, or even troublesome individuals were written. These objects would then be ritually smashed, stabbed, burned, or buried, symbolically destroying the enemies they represented. It was like an ancient Egyptian version of a voodoo doll, but with official government approval. Imagine the sheer psychological impact of knowing your name was on one of those broken pots, destined for a ritualistic smashing. It certainly gives breaking up a whole new meaning. Tomb curses are perhaps the most famous. You've heard the tales, perhaps even felt a shiver down your spine thinking about the curse of the pharaohs, that supposedly plagued those who disturbed. Tutankhamun's tomb. While modern science attributes those unfortunate events to things like mold and ancient bacteria, the Egyptians themselves firmly believed in the power of their tomb curses. These weren't just dramatic warnings. They were meticulously crafted magical deterrents. Inscriptions on tomb walls would promise dire consequences for anyone who dared to defile the burial site or steal its contents. May he have no heir. May he not receive bread from the temple offerings. May he never be buried. May he be devoured by crocodiles and hippos. These were not polite suggestions to please keep off the grass. They were cosmic threats designed to inflict eternal suffering and damnation. Historians still argue whether these curses were genuinely believed to have supernatural power over tomb robbers, or if they served primarily as psychological deterrents, exploiting the deeply ingrained fear of divine retribution. Perhaps it was a bit of both. After all, if you believe that a pharaoh's curse could condemn your soul to wander eternally without sustenance, you might think twice about pocketing that gilded statuette. It's certainly more intimidating than a no trespassing sign, wouldn't you agree? The Egyptians believed in a vast pantheon of benevolent and malevolent spirits, demons, and entities that could influence daily life. The night hag was a common fear, a demon believed to cause nightmares and sleep paralysis. Spells were cast to protect sleepers, to ensure safe passage through the night, and to ward off the countless unseen dangers lurking in the dark. This constant awareness of the unknown and the desperate attempts to manipulate it fueled their magical practices. Every ritual, every incantation, every amulet was a plea, a demand, or a shield against the capricious forces of the cosmos. A quirky tidbit that illustrates their comprehensive approach to magic. There's a papyrus fragment that contains a spell to prevent a man from having an erection for a specific woman. Yes, you heard that right. It seems even ancient Egyptian dating had its fair share of magical interference, proving that some problems are truly timeless, just with different solutions. On the flip side, there were also spells to induce fertility, to ensure a successful childbirth, and to protect mothers and infants from harm. The integration of magic into every facet of life is a mainstream historical fact that cannot be overstated. From the moment you woke up to the moment you closed your eyes, you were surrounded by magical protections, rituals, and beliefs. Your house might have protective amulets embedded in its walls, your bed might have a magical headrest, and your very name might be part of a protective spell. It wasn't a separate, fringe practice. It was woven into the very fabric of society, as essential as the Nile itself. So, as you drift off tonight, imagine not just the serene beauty of ancient Egypt, but also the hum of its unseen magical currents. Picture the priests chanting under starlight, the commoner clutching an amulet, the carefully inscribed curses guarding hidden treasures. It's a world where the line between the sacred and the mundane, the natural and the supernatural, was beautifully, terrifyingly blurred. And in that blurring lies one of the most fascinating and, yes, filthy secrets of all, the relentless, often brutal, power of belief itself. That you've explored the grand temples, admired the intricate carvings, and perhaps even felt a tiny shiver, imagining the silent, watchful mummies within their gilded sarcophagi. But now, let's peel back another layer of that shimmering, golden facade, to reveal a truth that would have sent shivers down the spines of even the most powerful pharaohs: the relentless, often successful, assault on their eternal slumber. We're talking about rampant tomb robbery and desecration, a secret so widespread it almost became an open secret, a constant, nagging threat that haunted the afterlife plans of every wealthy ancient Egyptian. Imagine, if you will, the sheer effort involved in creating one of these elaborate eternal homes. You've got the quarrying of tons of stone, the back-breaking labor of carving out subterranean chambers, the intricate artistry of painting hieroglyphs and divine scenes, the painstaking process of mummification, and finally, the meticulous placement of countless treasures: gold, jewels, fine linen, furniture, even food and wine, all meant to accompany the deceased into the field of reeds. It was an investment of time, resources, and unwavering belief in the afterlife, designed to last for millennia. And yet, for many, this grand vision was shattered, sometimes within years, sometimes within mere months, by the clinking pickaxes and stealthy footsteps of those who sought to plunder the dead. Turns out, eternal rest wasn't quite so eternal. When there was a mountain of bling involved, you might think of tomb robbers as shadowy figures lurking in the deserts. But the truth is often far more complex and far more unsettling. Sometimes, they were the very people who knew the tombs best, the workmen who built them, the priests who performed the burial rituals, even high-ranking officials entrusted with their protection. Picture a moonless night, the desert air cool, and still, a group of men, their faces masked by darkness, slipping silently towards a newly sealed tomb. They aren't just looking for a quick buck. For many, it's a desperate gamble against the gnawing grip of poverty. The lure of gold, the glint of a precious amulet, the sheer volume of valuable grave goods. It was an almost irresistible temptation in a society where wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few, and the majority struggled daily. The methods they employed were often ingenious, if utterly disrespectful. You see, these aren't your typical smash-and-grab operations. These were sophisticated heists, sometimes involving years of planning. Robbers might tunnel for dozens of meters through solid rock, bypassing elaborate false walls and hidden shafts. They'd study the tomb's layout, perhaps even bribing a disgruntled worker for insider information. Imagine the sweat and dust, the flickering oil lamp casting dancing shadows as they chipped away, inch by agonizing inch, towards the treasure chamber. It's like a reverse archaeological dig, but with far less academic rigor and a much higher chance of being impaled on a spiked trap, though those were perhaps more Hollywood than historical reality, thankfully. Still, the thought of being caught by a furious temple guard, well, that was a very real, very unpleasant prospect. Once inside, the scene would be one of utter chaos. You can almost hear the muffled thuds as they frantically tore through burial shrouds, wrenched open sarcophagi, and stripped the mummies of their precious adornments. The serene, carefully arranged afterlife tableau would be transformed into a scene of desecration. Limbs might be broken, bandages ripped away, and the carefully placed amulets and jewelry, meant to protect the deceased on their journey, would be ripped off and stuffed into sacks. The very essence of the Egyptian belief in the afterlife was dependent on the integrity of the body and its associated grave goods. To disturb these was not merely theft. It was an act of profound spiritual violence, threatening the deceased's eternal survival and their ability to become an Ankh, a transfigured spirit. The scale of this problem was truly staggering. If you were to walk through the Valley of the Kings today, you'd notice that most of the grand tombs were plundered centuries ago, long before modern archaeology came calling. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 was so monumental, precisely because it was one of the few that had largely escaped the worst of the ancient looters. Even then, it showed signs of at least 2 attempts at robbery, with objects having been hastily rearranged. It underscores just how persistent and pervasive this threat was. Imagine trying to secure a treasure vault in the middle of a vast, empty desert for thousands of years. It's a bit like trying to keep a cookie jar safe when you've got a house full of sugar-crazed kids and no locks. The records of these illicit activities provide us with a fascinating, if grim, insight into ancient Egyptian law and order. One of the most famous examples comes from the village of Deir el-Medina, home to the artisans who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Thanks to a trove of papyri discovered there, we have detailed accounts of official investigations and trials concerning tomb robberies during the New Kingdom, particularly in the 20th dynasty. You can almost hear the frustrated sighs of the vizier as he reads through the latest report. Another one? Really? We just apprehended those guys last week. These documents describe how suspects were rounded up, interrogated, sometimes quite brutally, with beatings and torture, and if found guilty, faced severe punishments. These punishments were not for the faint of heart. You might be sentenced to mutilation, such as having your nose or ears cut off, a public mark of shame designed to deter others. Or, even more chillingly, you could face impalement on a stake, a slow and agonizing death designed to serve as a gruesome warning to anyone else contemplating a career in grave robbing. The sheer brutality of these deterrents highlights the extreme importance placed on protecting the sanctity of the royal tombs and their contents, not just for the deceased, but for the stability of the entire kingdom. After all, a pharaoh's successful journey to the afterlife was believed to ensure the prosperity of Egypt itself. One quirky tidbit amidst all this grim reality is the unusual measures taken by later priests to protect the royal mummies that hadn't been completely destroyed. In a desperate attempt to safeguard the remains of their revered rulers, priests would sometimes gather up mummies from ransacked tombs, rewrap them, and rebury them together in secret caches, often in less accessible locations. You can almost picture them, under the cloak of darkness, carefully carrying the remains of Seti I or Ramesses II, whispering prayers as they move their former kings to a new, hopefully safer, resting place. It's a testament to their enduring devotion, even in the face of widespread chaos and disrespect. It's like a historical game of hide and seek, but with very, very old, very important players. Historians still argue whether the widespread tomb robberies were primarily a result of desperate commoners driven by hunger, or if there was a deeper level of corruption and complicity within the state apparatus itself. Were the guards simply overwhelmed, or were some turning a blind eye, or even actively participating, in exchange for a cut of the loot? The papyri from Deir el-Medina certainly suggest that even high-ranking officials were not immune from suspicion, and some were indeed implicated in these crimes. It paints a picture of a society grappling with significant internal pressures, where the glittering wealth of the elite stood in stark contrast to the daily struggles of the populace, creating fertile ground for illicit activities. The evidence of this rampant plundering isn't just found in written records. When archaeologists excavate ancient burial sites, they often find compelling physical evidence of these ancient crimes. You might stumble upon a tomb with a gaping hole in its ceiling or a collapsed sidewall, revealing a crude tunnel. Inside, you'd find broken pottery, scattered bones, and the telltale signs of a hasty ransacking. Sarcophagi lids askew, empty jewelry boxes, and valuable artifacts conspicuously absent. It's a stark reminder that even the most elaborate security systems of the ancient world, the massive stone blocks, the hidden passages, the curses inscribed on walls, were often no match for human ingenuity driven by greed or desperation. Consider the sheer psychological impact on the living. If you were a wealthy Egyptian, meticulously planning your eternal resting place, knowing that it was highly probable your tomb would be violated, your body desecrated, and your carefully accumulated treasures stolen, it must have been a profoundly unsettling thought. It challenges the very core of their belief system. This promise of an eternal afterlife contingent on physical preservation and the presence of grave goods. It's like designing your dream retirement home, only to realize there's a standing invitation for every burglar in town. So, as you drift deeper into the secrets of ancient Egypt, remember this: beneath the serene, idealized images of pharaohs and gods, beneath the monumental architecture, lay a constant struggle against human nature's darker impulses. The glittering promises of eternal life were often tarnished by the grim reality of greed and desperation, leaving countless royal and noble mummies stripped bare, their eternal slumber brutally interrupted. The echoes of those clinking pickaxes and hurried footsteps still resonate through the silent, empty chambers of robbed tombs, a testament to the fact that some secrets, no matter how carefully buried, are simply too valuable to remain hidden. You've wandered through the grand temples and peered into the tombs, perhaps even imagined the bustling markets of ancient Egypt. But as the sun dips lower, casting long shadows over the sandy plains, we're going to step into a corner of their world that, for all its reverence, was undeniably disturbing. You see, the ancient Egyptians didn't just respect animals. They worshipped them with a fervent, often unsettling, devotion that manifested in ways that would make even the most dedicated modern pet owner raise an eyebrow. Imagine, if you will, a vast landscape dotted with temples dedicated not just to human-faced gods, but to the very creatures that scurried, slithered, and soared around them. You might think of Batet, the cat goddess, all grace and feline mystique, or Thoth, the god of wisdom, often depicted with the head of an ibis or a baboon. Sobuk, the crocodile god, lord of the waters. Horus, the falcon-headed protector. Hathor, the cow goddess, nurturing and powerful. And, of course, Anubis, the jackal-headed guide to the afterlife. These weren't just symbolic representations. These animals were considered living vessels for the divine, earthly incarnations of the gods themselves. Now, this deep reverence had a flip side, a rather macabre one that involved mass production and a peculiar form of piety. When you think of mummification, your mind probably jumps to pharaohs and nobles, carefully preserved for their journey to the do-it. But the Egyptians didn't stop there. Oh no, they mummified animals. And not just a few beloved pets, mind you, but on a scale that beggars belief. We're talking millions, tens of millions. It's enough to make you wonder if they had a dedicated Mummy of the Month club going on. You can almost smell it, can't you? The dry, dusty scent of ancient linen mixed with something earthy, perhaps a little metallic, from the sheer volume of desiccated flesh. Picture yourself walking through vast underground catacombs, not filled with human sarcophagi, but with stacks upon stacks of neatly wrapped animal remains. Here, a tiny bundle containing a shriveled shrew. There, a larger package holding a perfectly preserved ibis. And over yonder, rows and rows of carefully interred crocodiles, their leathery hides still discernible beneath the bandages. These mummified animals served a variety of purposes, each more fascinating and unsettling than the last. Many were votive offerings, gifts to the gods. You, as a devout Egyptian, might visit a temple dedicated to Batet, hoping for good fortune or perhaps a cure for an ailment. What better way to curry favor with the cat goddess than to offer her a mummified cat? It was like leaving a particularly elaborate and slightly morbid 5-star review for the deity. People would purchase these mummified animals from specialized vendors, much like you might buy a candle or a floral offering at a modern temple or church today. Except, with less fire hazard and more ancient animal parts. And this wasn't just a casual side hustle for the priests. It was a massive industry. Archaeological digs have unearthed entire necropolises dedicated solely to animals. At Saqqara, for instance, you find vast galleries filled with millions of bird mummies, mostly ibises and falcons. Nearby, there are catacombs for dogs, baboons, and even vast numbers of scarab beetles. Imagine the sheer logistics involved: raising these animals, processing them, wrapping them, and then transporting them to these sacred burial grounds. It wasn't just a cottage industry. It was an industrial complex of spiritual sacrifice. Mainstream historical fact: over 30 million mummified ibises alone have been discovered at the site of Tuna el Gebel, a testament to the sheer scale of this practice. That's enough birds to make you wonder if they ran out of trees for them to perch on. The process itself, while not as elaborate as royal human mummification, was still meticulous. For the smaller creatures, like ibises, their internal organs might be removed through a small incision, their bodies then dehydrated using natron salt, and finally wrapped in layers of linen. Larger animals, like crocodiles or bulls, would undergo a more involved process, sometimes taking weeks. The goal was always preservation, to ensure the offering was pristine for the divine recipient. But here's where it gets a little darker. A little more factory farm-esque. Many of these animals weren't wild creatures caught for sacrifice. Oh no, they were bred for the purpose. Think about it. If you need millions of ibises to satisfy the demand for votive offerings, you can't just rely on catching them in the Nile marshes. No, you establish dedicated breeding programs. There were likely temple-run farms, where animals were raised specifically to become mummies. It's a strange juxtaposition, isn't it? Reverence leading to mass production, a spiritual assembly line. It raises questions about the animal's quality of life, though given the context, that's probably a modern concern they wouldn't have even contemplated. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for these mass animal mummifications was genuine piety, economic enterprise, or a complex blend of both. Was it truly a deep spiritual connection, or did the priests realize they had a gold mine on their hands, literally selling divine intercession wrapped in linen? Probably a bit of column A, a bit of column B, with a healthy dose of entrepreneurial spirit thrown in. After all, Ancient Egypt was nothing if not practical, and sometimes the offering wasn't even what it seemed. Quirky or fringe tidbit. X-ray analyses of many animal mummies have revealed that a significant percentage are either entirely empty, containing only a few bones or feathers, or are incomplete. Imagine the ancient equivalent of buying a designer handbag, only to find it's filled with newspaper. You'd pay good money for a mummified ibis, only to unwrap it, metaphorically. Of course, you wouldn't actually unwrap it. That would be sacrilege. And find a single feather and a stick. Were these ancient scams? Or were they symbolic offerings, where the intent of the mummy was more important than its contents? It's a question that still makes modern archaeologists scratch their heads, wondering if they were dealing with divine devotion or ancient trickery. The sheer volume of these mummies also speaks to the profound belief in the afterlife for animals, or at least their ability to accompany humans. Some were indeed beloved pets, mummified and buried alongside their owners, much like you might bury your cherished dog or cat today, albeit with far more elaborate rituals. Imagine the scene: a grieving owner carefully wrapping their departed feline companion, believing it would join them in the field of reeds. It's a surprisingly tender thought amidst the industrial scale of the votive offerings. But then you consider the other side. The animal cults weren't always just about gentle reverence. They could be brutal. Take the cult of Sobuk, the crocodile god. While many crocodiles were bred and mummified, there are also accounts and archaeological evidence of ritualistic killing. The sheer power and danger of a crocodile were awe-inspiring to the Egyptians, making them a potent symbol of divine might. To sacrifice such a creature was a profound act. You wouldn't want to be the intern tasked with cleaning up after that particular ceremony. Just grab the broom, Dave, and maybe a very long stick. Or consider the Apis bull, a sacred living embodiment of the god Ptah and later Osiris. Only one Apis bull could exist at a time, chosen for its specific markings: a white triangle on its forehead, a scarab beetle shape under its tongue, etc. When an Apis bull died, it was a national tragedy, followed by an elaborate period of mourning and a truly colossal mummification and burial process, often in monumental sarcophagi weighing many tons. The Serapeum at Saqqara, the burial place of the Apis bulls, is a chilling testament to this devotion, a vast underground labyrinth filled with these enormous stone coffins. It's like a graveyard for giants, each one a testament to a single, revered animal. The unsettling practices weren't confined to land animals either. Fish were mummified, snakes, even beetles. The entire ecosystem of Egypt, from the smallest insect to the largest hippopotamus, could find its way into a linen shroud if it was deemed sacred or useful as an offering. It speaks to a worldview where the divine permeated every aspect of nature, blurring the lines between the mundane and the sacred. So, as you drift off, think about the ancient Egyptian and their furry, scaly, and feathered friends. They revered them, yes, but often in ways that seem utterly alien to our modern sensibilities. It was a world where piety met profit, where reverence met mass production, and where the line between a sacred offering and a commodity could become incredibly blurred. A world where millions of animals ended up wrapped in bandages, waiting for eternity, a silent testament to a faith that was as complex as it was compelling, and often profoundly unsettling. That you've wandered through the dusty streets of the common folk, peered into the messy process of mummification, and even glimpsed the surprising intimacies of ancient Egyptian life. But now, as the sands of time swirl around us, we're going to pull back the heavy, velvet curtains of the royal palace itself. Leave your sandals at the door, because what lies beyond these gilded walls isn't just gold and grandeur. It's a swirling vortex of ambition, paranoia, and the chilling whisper of betrayal. You imagine the pharaoh, a living god, untouchable, serene on his golden throne. But the truth? Even a god king had to sleep sometime, and that's when the knives, both literal and metaphorical, started to come out. Think of it like the ultimate, high-stakes reality show, centuries before television was even a twinkle in anyone's eye. Only, instead of being voted off the island, you might just be voted off existence. The stakes were astronomical. Power in ancient Egypt wasn't just about wealth. It was about divine right, control over millions, and the very stability of the cosmos as they understood it. So, when that kind of power is up for grabs, or when a ruler is perceived as weak, or when a disgruntled queen or ambitious vizier sees an opening, well, let's just say the palace became less of a sanctuary and more of a viper's nest. You might think your office politics are bad, but at least your biggest worry isn't usually being impaled for suggesting a different coffee brand. The air inside these royal residences, despite the fragrant incense and fresh linen, often hung heavy with unspoken rivalries. Every smile could hide a calculated agenda, every whispered conversation a potential plot. The pharaoh, for all his divine aura, was still a human being, susceptible to illness, old age, and, most dangerously, the machinations of those closest to him. Succession was a perennial headache. Who would rule next? The eldest son? A favorite? A more politically astute sibling? These questions simmered constantly, ready to boil over into full-blown treachery. Imagine the tension at the royal dinner table. Pass the lentils, dear. And by the way, are you sure that's just a cough? One of the most infamous and well-documented cases of royal assassination attempts, a true mainstream historical fact that sends shivers down the spine, is the harem conspiracy against Ramesses III. Picture this. It's the twilight of the New Kingdom, around 1155 BCE. Ramesses III, a pharaoh who had fought off invaders and brought a semblance of stability, was growing old. His reign, while initially strong, was now plagued by economic woes and internal dissent. You can almost feel the unease rippling through the court. His great royal wife, Queen Titi, had borne him a legitimate heir, but a secondary wife, Queen Tai, had a son named Penaware, whom she desperately wanted on the throne. And when a mother wants something for her child, especially a royal mother with access to court magicians and disgruntled officials, things can get complicated. Queen Tai wasn't alone in her ambition. She gathered a formidable network of conspirators, high-ranking officials, royal cupbearers, stewards of the harem, even the chief of the treasury. It was a who's who of palace insiders, all with their own grievances or aspirations. They saw Ramesses III's waning power as their golden opportunity. Their plan was audacious, involving a multi-pronged attack on the pharaoh during the beautiful Festival of the Valley, a time when the court would be distracted by religious processions and public celebrations. It's like planning a coup during the Super Bowl halftime show. Everyone's looking the other way. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit that really highlights the strange blend of the practical and the mystical in ancient Egypt. The conspirators didn't just rely on daggers and poison. Oh no, they also dabbled in dark magic. Imagine the scene. Hidden chambers within the palace, not just for storing treasures, but for crafting sinister spells. They reportedly made wax figures of the pharaoh and other officials, much like voodoo dolls, intending to inflict harm from afar. They also used magical texts and potions, hoping to weaken Ramesses III's spirit and body, making him vulnerable to their physical attacks. It's like they were covering all their bases, sharp objects for the body, dark arts for the soul. You can almost hear the chief magician probably muttering, "Right, just need a bit more eye of newt and a dash of pharaoh's hair for maximum effect, you understand." The details of the plot were meticulously laid out, aiming to cause a full-scale rebellion within the royal harem and beyond. They sought to incite the populace, to turn them against the old pharaoh and usher in a new era with Penaware at the helm. It was a massive undertaking, requiring incredible coordination and secrecy. But as with many grand conspiracies, a single loose thread can unravel the whole tapestry. The plot was discovered, reportedly before it could fully unfold, though historians still argue whether Ramesses III was truly killed during the initial attack or succumbed to his wounds later, or perhaps even died of natural causes shortly after the plot was foiled. Forensic examination of his mummy in recent years revealed a deep, wide cut across his throat, strongly suggesting a brutal assassination. So, while the initial discovery might have saved the dynasty from immediate collapse, it seems the pharaoh himself did not escape unscathed. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The judicial papyrus of Turin meticulously records the trials of the conspirators. You can almost hear the stern pronouncements of the judges, the fear in the accused voices. Over 30 individuals were implicated, ranging from high-ranking officials to humble servants. The punishments were severe, designed to send a chilling message. Some were executed by burning, their bodies consumed by fire, so their souls could not find rest in the afterlife, a truly terrifying prospect for an Egyptian. Others were forced to commit suicide, a macabre honor reserved for those of higher status, like Penaware. Imagine the pharaoh's court, usually a place of ritual and order, now consumed by the grim spectacle of justice, or perhaps vengeance. Pentaware himself was found guilty and, it is believed, ordered to take his own life, dying by poison or strangulation. The papyrus refers to it euphemistically as him dying by his own hand, but it was no choice at all. It was a forced, desperate act. The sheer scale of the harem conspiracy reveals just how vulnerable even the most powerful pharaohs could be. It shatters the illusion of divine invincibility, showing that the palace, far from being a serene sanctuary, was a hotbed of human ambition, jealousy, and fear. You think about modern security details for world leaders and realize that ancient pharaohs, despite their godlike status, were often surprisingly exposed to internal threats. There were no bulletproof chariots or secret service agents whispering into earpieces, just heavily armed guards who might, themselves, be part of the plot. It's enough to make you feel a little grateful for your own relatively drama-free evening. Beyond Ramesses III, while specific details are often scarcer, the specter of treachery haunted many reigns. The sudden, mysterious disappearance or death of a pharaoh or powerful official often sparked whispers of foul play. The reign of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, ended abruptly, and while natural causes are most likely, the radical changes he imposed on Egyptian society certainly created a climate where plots could have brewed. Even the young Tutankhamun's death was long debated, with theories ranging from a chariot accident to a blow to the head, suggesting assassination, though modern analysis points more strongly to a bone infection or other natural causes. The very fact that assassination was considered a plausible explanation for royal deaths speaks volumes about the perceived dangers within the palace walls. The constant threat of betrayal meant that pharaohs and their closest advisors lived in a state of perpetual vigilance. Trust was a rare and precious commodity. Every promotion, every demotion, every shift in influence could trigger a cascade of fear and ambition. Imagine being a high-ranking official, knowing that one wrong word, one perceived slight, could lead to your downfall, or worse. The royal court was a gilded cage, beautiful on the outside, but often filled with suffocating paranoia on the inside. It's a bit like being stuck in a never-ending group project where everyone secretly wants to take all the credit and maybe also sabotage your laptop. This intricate dance of power and peril wasn't just about the pharaoh. Queens, princes, viziers, and even powerful priests were all players in this dangerous game. A queen might conspire to ensure her son's succession, a vizier might seek to consolidate his own power, or a general might eye the throne from afar. The army, too, could be a source of instability if its leaders became too ambitious or felt slighted. The palace was a microcosm of the larger society, but with the volume turned up to 11, where every personal grievance could escalate into a national crisis. Ultimately, these stories of treachery and royal assassination remind us that even in a civilization that projected an image of perfect order and divine rule, the messy, often brutal realities of human nature were never far beneath the surface. The glittering facade of ancient Egypt, so often presented as an unchanging, harmonious empire, concealed a dark underbelly of ambition, fear, and the chilling willingness to spill royal blood for the ultimate prize. It's a stark reminder that power, no matter how divinely sanctioned, always comes with a target on its back. And as you drift off, you can almost hear the whispers of the palace walls, still holding their ancient, deadly secrets you've seen. The grand depictions, haven't you? The towering temple walls, meticulously carved, showing pharaohs, larger than life, smiting their enemies with effortless grace. Ramesses II, magnificent in his chariot, bow drawn, a veritable god of war his foes scattering like chaff before the wind. It's a powerful image, designed to inspire awe and reinforce the divine right of kings. But pull back the camera. Zoom in past the heroic posturing, and you'll find the true, grittier reality of ancient Egyptian warfare was, well, less like a ballet and more like a particularly brutal mosh pit. Forget the sanitized versions. Forget the glorious charge. Imagine yourself, not as the pharaoh, but as a foot soldier. You are a conscript, perhaps a farmer pulled from your fields, or a professional warrior, hardened by previous skirmishes. Your uniform, if you can call it that, is simple linen, probably already sweat-stained and dusty. You carry a heavy shield, perhaps made of wood and oxhide, and a bronze axe or a spear with a flint tip. Your sandals kick up dust with every weary step as you trudge for weeks, sometimes months, across unforgiving terrain. The sun beats down relentlessly, baking the very air you breathe. Dust coats your throat. Your skin feels like sandpaper, and every joint aches. No breathable fabrics there, my friend. Just the chafing reality of long marches under a desert sun. The logistics alone were a nightmarish challenge. Moving thousands of men, their supplies, their water, their weapons, and often their animals. Horses for chariots, oxen for transport, across vast, often arid landscapes required an organizational feat that would make a modern military planner weep. You relied on sparse oases, the meandering Nile, and the ingenuity of quartermasters to keep you fed and watered. And even then, hunger and thirst were constant companions, gnawing at your resolve long before you ever saw an enemy. Then comes the battle itself. It doesn't begin with a polite exchange of pleasantries. It begins with the thrumming tension of anticipation, the distant shouts, the glint of weapons. The air fills with the thwip of arrows, fired from powerful composite bows, weapons that could pierce flesh and bone with terrifying efficiency. You hear the dull thud as one finds its mark, the sharp crack of a shield struck. The chariots, those fast, mobile platforms, are indeed formidable. They thunder across the ground, a whirlwind of wheels and horseflesh, their archers raining down projectiles. But they're not invincible. They get bogged down in uneven terrain, horses stumble, and their crews are exposed, vulnerable to concentrated fire. It's not a joyride. It's a high-stakes, high-speed gamble where one wrong move means a tumble into the dust, likely under the hooves of your own advancing comrades. But the true horror unfolds when the lines clash. This isn't a neat, choreographed dance. It's a chaotic, visceral maelstrom. Imagine the sound, the clang of bronze on bronze, the thwack of axe on shield, the guttural shouts of men, the screams of the wounded. The smell is overwhelming: sweat, fear, dust, and the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood. You're in a press of bodies, pushing, shoving, struggling for every inch. Your weapon becomes an extension of your desperation. You swing, you thrust, you parry, your muscles burning, your breath ragged. The blows you deliver and the blows you receive are not clean. A bronze axe doesn't just cut. It crushes, it tears, it splinters bone. A spear thrust can open a gaping wound, leading to rapid blood loss, or worse, a slow, agonizing death from infection in a world utterly devoid of antibiotics. A simple cut could turn gangrenous within days, leading to amputation or a fever that burns you from the inside out. You didn't just worry about getting an arrow in the knee. You worried about what you drank from the local well or the festering scratch you got from a thorn. And when the fighting subsides, the grim reality of the battlefield settles in. It's not just a place of glory. It's a charnel house. The cries of the wounded mingle with the silence of the dead. Bodies lie twisted and broken, some barely recognizable. And then comes the grim, pragmatic task of tallying the enemy slain. The Egyptians, like many ancient peoples, had a rather unsentimental method. They would often mutilate the bodies of their foes, cutting off hands or, for male combatants, their phalluses, to present as proof of kills. Imagine being the poor soldier whose job it was to collect those. Not exactly a fun Friday afternoon activity, is it? These grim trophies were meticulously counted, ensuring the pharaoh's scribes could accurately record the scale of the victory. What of the captives? Mercy was often a luxury in ancient warfare, not a given right. Survivors of a defeated army or the inhabitants of a conquered city faced a brutal fate. Many were enslaved, marched back to Egypt in chains, destined for a life of grueling forced labor in quarries, mines, or on monumental construction projects. Others might face public execution, a stark warning to any who dared defy Egyptian might. The lucky ones might be integrated into the lower echelons of Egyptian society, their identities slowly eroded. Beyond the immediate brutality of the battlefield, the long-term impacts of warfare were equally devastating. Egyptian campaigns, such as the extensive ones waged by Thutmose III, were not just one-off skirmishes. They were strategic endeavors aimed at securing resources, controlling vital trade routes, and establishing Egyptian dominance over neighboring territories. This required sustained military presence, garrisoning of conquered lands, and the imposition of tribute. The constant drain on resources, both human and material, was immense. This systematic approach to military expansion, seen clearly in the annals of pharaohs like Thutmose III, who led numerous campaigns into the Near East, represents a mainstream historical fact that underscores the aggressive and expansive nature of the new kingdom. Disease, too, was often a deadlier foe than any human enemy. Armies on the march were breeding grounds for epidemics. Dysentery, typhoid, smallpox. These unseen enemies could decimate an army before they even reached the battlefield. Unsanitary camp conditions, contaminated water sources, and close quarters created perfect vectors for illness, turning a triumphant advance into a desperate struggle for survival. You didn't just worry about getting an arrow in the knee. You worried about what you drank from the local well. And it wasn't just human soldiers who faced the horrors of war. A quirky tidbit often overlooked is the significant role of military dogs. The Egyptians employed powerful canines, likely mastiff types, in battle. These war dogs, often depicted in reliefs, would charge alongside their human handlers, used to disrupt enemy formations, track fleeing foes, and guard camps. Imagine a growling, teeth-bared canine charging alongside you. Not quite a fluffy poodle. They were fierce companions, probably got better rations than some of the foot soldiers, and added another layer of terror to the battlefield. The psychological toll on the soldiers was immense, even if not formally recognized or treated as it would be today. The constant fear, the witnessing of unspeakable horrors, the act of taking a life. These experiences would have left indelible marks. They didn't have therapy. They just had more war, or the grim return to a society that expected them to simply pick up their lives. You carried those images, those sounds, those smells with you, a silent burden that surely haunted the veterans of these brutal campaigns. Even the most celebrated victories carried a hidden cost. Take the Battle of Kadesh, for instance. Historians still argue whether the Battle of Kadesh, often depicted by Ramesses II as a glorious and decisive victory, was truly a decisive win, or more of a strategic stalemate, given the heavy losses on both sides and the eventual peace treaty that followed years later. The pharaoh's propaganda depicted utter triumph, but the reality was a hard-fought, bloody engagement that saw both sides suffer grievously, ultimately leading to the world's first recorded peace treaty. It reminds us that behind the grand narratives of conquest, there was always the brutal, messy reality of human conflict, where even the winners paid a heavy price in blood and suffering. So, when you next encounter those magnificent reliefs of pharaohs trampling their foes, take a moment to peer beyond the polished stone. Imagine the dust, the sweat, the fear, the screams, the raw, unvarnished brutality. Imagine the soldier, not the god, fighting for his life, facing not just a mythical enemy, but the very real, gruesome reality of ancient warfare. It's a stark reminder that even the most glittering civilizations were built on foundations often soaked in blood and human suffering, that you've seen the gleaming gold, the towering pyramids, the serene faces of the pharaohs, all bathed in the eternal sunshine of the Nile Valley. But imagine for a moment that the sun, usually a benevolent friend, turns into a relentless enemy, baking the earth until it cracks like an old pottery shard. You picture the Nile, lifeblood of Egypt, a river, so reliable it was practically a deity itself, delivering its annual, predictable bounty. But what happens when that predictable bounty fails? When the life-giving waters recede, not just for a season, but for years, turning verdant fields into dust bowls and fertile floodplains into barren wasteland. This is where the glittering facade of ancient Egypt truly began to crumble, revealing the raw, desperate struggle beneath. The very existence of their civilization hinged entirely on the Nile's annual inundation, the Ake, which deposited nutrient-rich silt and watered the land. When these floods were too low or even too high, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an existential threat. You feel the parched air catch in your throat, taste the grit of dust on your tongue. The first signs are subtle. The water level, marks on the nilometers, those ancient gauges, start to creep lower than usual. Farmers, their faces etched with worry, watch as the precious black earth doesn't get its usual drenching. The seeds they've sown, once so full of promise, lie dormant, or worse, sprout weakly only to wither under the relentless sun. One season turns into two, then three. The granaries, usually bursting with barley and emmer wheat, begin to look emptier. The cheerful chatter of the marketplace gives way to hushed whispers, then anxious murmurs. Soon, the whispers turn to cries. The gnawing hunger starts subtly, a discomfort in your belly, easily ignored with a little less food. But it grows, day by day, into a relentless, burning ache. You find yourself constantly thinking of food, dreaming of the taste of fresh bread or a handful of dates. Your muscles weaken, your movements become slow and deliberate, conserving precious energy. Children, usually so full of boundless energy, grow quiet, their eyes wide and vacant. This wasn't just a bad harvest. This was famine, a slow, agonizing death that crept into every home, every family. Imagine the pharaoh, the divine king, supposedly responsible for the very flow of the Nile, for the prosperity of his land. His priests would perform rituals, offer prayers, but the river remained stubbornly low. Even the pharaoh's best PR team would struggle to make no food sound appealing, let alone divine. It makes your modern-day panic buying of toilet paper during a pandemic seem quaint, doesn't it? The faith of the people, so deeply intertwined with their ruler's ability to ensure abundance, begins to fray. How could a god on earth allow his people to starve? As the famine deepens, the social fabric begins to unravel. The strict hierarchies, the orderly administration, the sense of communal purpose, all start to buckle under the immense pressure of survival. What do you do when your family is starving? You become desperate. You might try to sell your meager possessions, then your tools, then perhaps even yourself or your children into servitude, just for a morsel of food. This desperation inevitably boiled over into widespread unrest and riots. You see it in the historical records, in the lamentations of scribes who witnessed these dark times. People, driven by the primal urge to feed themselves and their families, would descend upon granaries, not caring about the royal seal or the guards. They would loot, they would fight, they would do whatever it took. The streets, once bustling with commerce and daily life, become dangerous places filled with gaunt, angry faces. The normal rules of society, the laws of Ma'at, cosmic order and justice, break down. You might witness a mob, their hunger-cazed eyes fixed on a distant, well-guarded storehouse. The pharaoh's soldiers, themselves likely weakened and demoralized by the lack of food and constant tension, struggle to maintain control. Sometimes, they might even join the rioters, abandoning their posts for a chance at survival. Imagine trying to explain to a starving farmer that his divine ruler just needed a little more time to manifest the barley. The very idea becomes absurd, and the pharaoh's authority, once absolute, begins to evaporate like water in the desert. One of the most profound examples of this social collapse, directly linked to environmental factors, is the end of the Old Kingdom, ushering in what historians call the First Intermediate Period. This was a period of profound decentralization and chaos. For centuries, the Old Kingdom had been a shining beacon of stability, with a powerful central government and pharaohs, who commanded immense resources to build those monumental pyramids we still marvel at today. But then, around 2181 BCE, things fell apart. The mainstream historical fact is that a prolonged period of exceptionally low Nile floods, lasting for several decades, is widely considered a major contributing factor to the collapse of the Old kingdom and the ensuing societal breakdown. The agricultural base, already stretched by the demands of feeding a large population and funding massive royal projects, simply couldn't sustain itself. With the central government weakened, regional governors, known as nomarchs, began to assert their independence. They stopped sending taxes to the capital, began to raise their own armies, and effectively became petty kings in their own territories. You can imagine the impact. Trade routes become dangerous, infrastructure projects halt, and the grand vision of a unified Egypt shatters into a patchwork of squabbling mini-states. It's like a corporate merger gone horribly wrong, but instead of just losing your job, you're losing your entire food supply chain. The texts from this period, known as the Lamentations or Admonitions, paint a grim picture. They describe a world turned upside down. The rich become poor, the poor become powerful, chaos reigns, and the dead are left unburied. One such text famously laments, "He who had no box now possesses a treasure chest. He who made for himself furniture now lies on the bare ground." It's a world where the natural order, both cosmic and social, has been violently disrupted. A quirky, perhaps even legendary, tidbit comes from the famine stela, an inscription found on Sehel Island near Aswan. This stela, though likely a much later fabrication or embellishment of an older tale, vividly describes a 7-year famine during the reign of King Djoser, the pyramid builder. It tells of a time when the grain was short, the vegetables were dry, everything which people ate perished. Every man robbed his brother. While the stela itself might be propaganda designed to legitimize a local cult, it powerfully illustrates the ancient Egyptians' deep-seated fear of famine and their understanding of its devastating consequences. It suggests that the memory of such terrible events lingered for centuries, shaping their worldview. Historians still argue whether the prolonged low floods were the sole catalyst for the Old Kingdom's collapse, or merely a significant contributing factor alongside political infighting, administrative overreach, and the growing power of the nomarchs. It's rarely just one thing, is it? But the environmental shock was undeniably a major trigger, pulling the rug out from under a system that relied utterly on a predictable, abundant Nile. Even in later periods, when Egypt was strong, the threat of famine loomed. You can imagine the pharaohs and their advisors, always with one eye on the river's height, anxiously awaiting the annual inundation. A bad flood year wasn't just a statistic. It was a death sentence for countless people, a catalyst for social unrest that could destabilize the entire kingdom. The grand monuments, the intricate rituals, the divine kingship, all became meaningless when your stomach was empty and your children cried from hunger. The filthy secret here isn't just the raw desperation, but the constant, underlying fragility of a civilization so magnificent yet so utterly dependent on the whims of a single river. It reminds you that even the most powerful empires are ultimately at the mercy of forces far greater than themselves. You've journeyed with me through the gilded halls and the meticulously prepared tombs, witnessing the lengths to which Egypt's elite went to secure their eternal slumber. You've seen the grand mummification, the intricate sarcophagi, the mountains of grave goods designed to furnish an opulent afterlife. But now, as the soft desert breeze whispers through the imaginary dunes outside your window, let's pull back the final, most poignant veil. Let's consider the untold millions who didn't get that grand send-off. The vast, silent majority whose final resting places were anything but monumental, often forgotten even before the desert winds had shifted the sand over their meager graves. Imagine, if you will, the stark reality for the common Egyptian, the farmer, the artisan, the laborer whose back-breaking toil built those very monuments we marvel at today. Their lives were a relentless cycle of sun-drenched labor, simple sustenance, and a constant negotiation with the whims of the Nile and the local overseer. When their time came, and often it came far too soon, perhaps from a sudden illness, a workplace accident, or simply the cumulative weariness of a hard life, there was no procession of priests, no embalming rituals stretching over 70 days, no gilded masks or canopic jars awaiting them. For most, death arrived quietly, perhaps in a mud brick home or out in the fields. or even at the very foot of a construction site. And their burial? It was as simple, as unceremonious as their daily existence. You wouldn't find them interred in elaborate rock-cut tombs, sealed away with spells and protective deities. Oh no, their final resting place was, more often than not, a shallow pit dug directly into the desert sand, usually just outside the village or settlement. You can almost feel the dry, gritty earth beneath your fingers as you imagine the hurried excavation, the sun beating down, the silent, weary work of family or friends. The body itself received minimal preparation. Forget the intricate brain extraction or the careful removal of organs. For the vast majority, the deceased would be simply wrapped in a few layers of coarse linen cloth, or perhaps even just a woven reed mat. Sometimes, they were placed directly into the sand without even that much, their bodies naturally adopting a flexed, fetal position, as if curled in eternal sleep. It's a poignant image, isn't it? From the grandeur of a pharaoh's sarcophagus to a simple, sandy embrace. You might imagine even the poorest had a simple wooden box, but often, the coffin was little more than a woven reed mat, a few bundled sticks, or sometimes, just the earth itself. It was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of some assembly required. Burial, only the assembly was mostly done by the desert itself. Now, here's a mainstream historical fact that adds a layer of unexpected preservation to this humble end. The very dryness and heat of the desert, sand acted as a natural desiccant. Many of these bodies, buried directly in the hot, arid earth, underwent a process of natural mummification. The sand rapidly absorbed the bodily fluids, preventing decomposition and often preserving the soft tissues, hair, and even clothing for millennia. So, while they didn't receive the artificial mummification so famous today, the desert itself often provided a silent, unintentional embalming service, free of charge. It's like Mother Nature decided to offer a budget-friendly preservation package. Grave goods? Those lavish collections of furniture, jewelry, and provisions meant to sustain the deceased in the afterlife. For the common person, these were almost non-existent. You might find a simple, utilitarian pot, perhaps a worn-out bead necklace, or a humble tool placed beside them. More often, there was nothing at all. Their afterlife, it seems, was not expected to be furnished with earthly luxuries, but perhaps with something more ethereal, or simply less demanding. It paints a very different picture of the ancient Egyptian understanding of eternity, doesn't it? No need for a celestial chariot if you're just walking to the next dimension. These humble burials also present immense challenges for archaeologists. Unlike the prominent pyramids or the well-mapped Valley of the Kings, these commoner cemeteries were often unmarked, unrecorded, and easily lost to the shifting sands or later development. You won't find grand stele or inscribed tomb walls proclaiming their names or achievements. The identities of these individuals are almost entirely unknown to us today. They are the silent, countless ones, their stories buried not in grand narratives, but in the quiet anonymity of the earth. It's like trying to find Waldo, but Waldo is a grain of sand in a very, very large desert. This anonymity extends beyond individual graves. Many of these common burial grounds were reused over generations, with new interments disturbing older ones, further blurring the lines of individual identity and making systematic study incredibly difficult. It speaks to a different kind of respect for the dead, one rooted in necessity and practicality rather than elaborate ritual. And what about their hopes for the afterlife? This is where an open scholarly debate phrase comes into play. Historians still argue whether the elaborate and desirable afterlife, so meticulously prepared for the elite, was truly believed to be accessible to the vast, unmummified masses, or if their hopes for eternity were far more modest and uncertain. Did they truly believe they would stand before Osiris and have their hearts weighed, just like the pharaoh? Or was their concept of the afterlife a more ethereal, less defined continuation, perhaps a simple return to the earth, or a joining with the ancestral spirits in a less tangible realm? It's a profound question, isn't it? Did the afterlife have a VIP section, and was everyone else just on the general admission list, hoping for the best? Consider the unceremonious ends in their most stark form. What if someone died far from home, perhaps on a long journey or during a military campaign? What if a sudden plague swept through a village, overwhelming the capacity for even simple burials? In such cases, the interments would be even more hurried, even less individual, sometimes leading to mass graves where bodies were simply laid side by side, covered over, and left to the elements. These are the truly overlooked, the forgotten among the forgotten. Their resting places are often discovered accidentally, a poignant testament to lives ended abruptly. Without the dignity of individual ceremony, there's a quirky tidbit that further highlights this. Archaeologists have occasionally discovered bodies in situations that suggest a complete lack of formal burial, such as individuals found in abandoned houses, sometimes under collapsed walls, or even within what appear to be refuse pits. While these might be unusual circumstances, perhaps accidental deaths or the result of extreme poverty or social upheaval, they underscore the reality that not everyone received even a shallow grave. Some simply vanished, their bodies left to the elements or the scavengers, a truly unceremonious and often tragic end for individuals in a society so seemingly obsessed with death and the afterlife. The sheer scale of these unmummified, untombed dead is staggering. For every pharaoh, every high priest, every wealthy noble whose elaborate tomb we've explored, there were thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of common people whose lives were lived and ended without fanfare. Their bodies returned to the earth with quiet simplicity. Their legacy isn't in grand monuments, but in the very soil of Egypt itself, a silent, vast testament to the enduring human experience of life, labor, and ultimately, an anonymous return to dust. As you drift off tonight, think not just of the golden masks and towering pyramids, but of the quiet, forgotten ones. The countless individuals whose stories are etched not in hieroglyphs, but in the very fabric of the desert, their resting places often neglected, yet holding the profound truth of ancient Egyptian life, lived and ended in its most elemental form. It adds a somber, yet deeply human, layer to the glittering facade of this ancient civilization, doesn't it? You've journeyed with me now, deep into the dusty, often unsettling corners of ancient Egypt, far beyond the gleaming gold masks and the serene, majestic pyramids. You've peered through the veil of splendor, not to diminish its grandeur, but to understand the very human, very messy foundations upon which it was built. And as the final grains of this historical hourglass trickle down, you realize something profound. These filthy secrets don't detract from Egypt's enduring allure. They deepen it, adding layers of complexity that make the civilization far more fascinating than any sanitized myth could ever be. Think back to the relentless struggle against plagues and parasites, the ever-present threat of dysentery that made a trip to the latrine a game of Russian roulette, or the sheer ubiquity of lice that probably made everyone's scalp feel like a busy playground, or the truly, unapologetically gory process of mummification, where skilled embalmers, not so much divine priests as highly specialized butchers, scooped out brains through the nose with a hook, a detail that still makes you instinctively wrinkle your own. These aren't just morbid curiosities. They're a stark reminder that even a civilization capable of such monumental feats was, at its core, grappling with the same biological realities you face every day. They remind you that, while they built for eternity, their bodies were very much of the earth, just like yours.